Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime Historian. Have you ever wondered how one woman, born with almost nothing on the edge of a vast empire, managed to command the largest pirate fleet the world had ever seen, thousands of ships, tens of thousands of men, and then walked away from it all with her life, her fortune, and her freedom intact? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening tonight, drop a quick comment with your location and the local time where you are right now. It's always comforting to know who's drifting off to history with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the final quarter of the 18th century, the Pearl River Delta was already one of the busiest, most crowded waterways on Earth. Guangzhou, known then to Europeans as Canton, was the only Chinese port legally open to foreign trade. Every day, thousands of vessels moved through the maze of channels, tea junks heading inland, salt barges, fishing boats, rice transports, and the endless small craft of people who lived their entire lives on the water. Among them were the tanker, often called boat people by those who lived on land. The Qing court classified them as a separate, inferior group, neither fully Han nor fully welcome in settled villages. They were barred from owning land, from taking the civil service examinations, from marrying into most land families. Their world was the river, the estuary, the shallow bays where the salt tide met fresh water. They built homes on narrow sampans and larger junks, patched hulls with tung oil and bamboo, cooked over charcoal braziers on tiny decks, raised children who learned to walk on gently rocking planks before they ever touched solid earth. It was into this floating society, sometime around 1775, that a girl was born who would later be known as Zheng Yi, literally the wife of Zheng Yi. Her birth name has not survived in any reliable record. Even her childhood given name is lost. Historians usually call her Shi Xianggu, or simply Ching Shih, after the Cantonese pronunciation of her married name. She entered life on one of those patched wooden boats, probably somewhere between the crowded floating markets of Guangzhou and the wider reaches of the delta where the sea began to show itself. Her earliest years passed in the narrow rhythm of tanker existence. Mornings started before dawn with the creak of oars and the slap of water against hulls. Women and girls hauled nets, sorted fish into baskets, mended sails with bone needles, carried water in buckets balanced on shoulder poles across swaying gangplanks. Meals were simple: rice porridge flavoured with dried shrimp or salted greens, steamed fish when the catch was good, occasionally a few coins spent on hot oil sticks or congee from a passing cookboat. Clothing was practical wide-legged trousers of dark cotton, loose tunics that could be tucked up for work, conical straw hats to shield the sun, bare feet calloused from years on wet wood. The tanker kept their own customs apart from the land people. They worshipped Tin Hao, the Empress of Heaven, protector of seafarers. Small shrines stood on many boats, red cloth draped over wooden tablets. Incense burned at the bow during storms. They told stories of dragons that lived in the river, of ghosts who wandered the channels at night searching for the living. Children grew up hearing these tales the way land children heard nursery rhymes. Socially, the tanker occupied a low rung. Officials viewed them with suspicion, rootless, hard to tax, quick to disappear into the maze of creeks if trouble came. Yet within their own communities, they maintained tight bonds. Families often stayed close for generations, boats mooring side by side, children betrothed young to keep alliances strong. A girl like the future Ching Shih would have learned early that survival depended on skill, on knowing the tides, on reading the weather in the sky, and on trusting the people who shared your deck. By her early teens, she had already seen more of the delta than most land dwellers ever would. She knew which channels ran deep at low tide, which sandbars appeared only during the dry season, where the freshwater villages traded for salt and dried fish. She knew the sound of different boat horns, The way merchants haggled in half a dozen dialects, the smell of burning joss sticks mixed with river mud and drying shrimp. Around this time, Guangzhou's floating brothels known as flower boats began to appear more frequently in the records. These were not small sampans, but larger, 2- or 3-decked vessels painted in bright colours, hung with lanterns, fitted with private cabins where wealthy merchants and officials could spend evenings away from their official residences. The women who worked on them came from various backgrounds. Some were sold into the life as children, others entered as adults seeking better wages than fishing or domestic service could offer. For a tanker girl without land or dowry, the flower boats sometimes represented one of the few paths to money and a measure of independence. By her late teens, probably around 1790, she had moved to that world. Exact details are scarce. No personal account from her survives. Contemporary Chinese sources describe the transition in general terms. Many boat girls ended up in the profession because it paid better than any other work available to women of their class. She would have learned quickly how to dress for the role. Silk robes in soft greens and pinks, hair pinned with jade or silver ornaments, face lightly powdered, lips touched with rouge. She learned to play the pippa, to pour wine without spilling, to keep conversation light while reading the mood of the men who climbed aboard. The flower boats anchored in clusters along the riverfront, especially near the foreign factories where British, French and American traders lived during the trading season. Lanterns reflected on the black water, music drifted across the channels, laughter and the clink of cups carried on the night air. For the women inside, the work was exhausting and often dangerous, yet it gave access to cash, to gifts of cloth and jewellery, to news from every corner of the empire and beyond. She was already in her mid-20s when she met Zheng Yi. Childhood, on the waters yet. The path that carried her to that meeting with Zheng Yi had begun many years earlier in the tight circle of her own family's sampan, where the daily work of staying afloat taught lessons no land school could offer. Her father managed the heavy labour of setting and hauling the large cast nets that required strength and timing to avoid tangling in the currents. He showed her how to judge the exact moment to pull when the net felt heavy with fish, explaining each motion without ever raising his voice. Her mother kept the household accounts in her head, tracking every coin earned from sales and every expense for rope or oil. As the eldest daughter, the girl was expected to watch and copy these tasks from the moment she could walk steadily on the deck. The family included an older brother who took charge of the smaller tasks, like baiting traps for crabs and shrimp. He would let her practice with him, correcting her grip on the lines so she would not lose them in the tide. The younger sisters followed her lead, copying how she coiled rope neatly or balanced buckets of water across the narrow gangplank. These close bonds meant that every success or setback belonged to everyone on board. When the catch was good, the entire family shared the satisfaction of hanging extra fish to dry in the sun. When it was poor, they shared the same thin porridge for supper and the same worry about the next day. Tanker families had their own quiet ways of marking the passing seasons. During the mid-autumn period, they would trade small bundles of mooncakes brought from shore vendors, passing them boat to boat with short greetings that carried across the water. The girl remembered the sweet taste of the filling and the careful way her mother divided the pieces so each child received the same amount. Another custom involved tying small red threads around the wrists of children during certain lunar months, believed to keep away minor illnesses that spread easily in the damp air. These threads were changed monthly and became a familiar part of her daily appearance. The Qing government's rules on boat registration created a steady background pressure that the family felt every year. Officials required each vessel to carry a stamped certificate listing the names of all occupants and the type of work they did. Renewal time meant a trip to a designated landing where clerks checked the papers and collected a small fee. If the certificate had been damaged by water or lost, the family faced fines that could eat up weeks of earnings. Her father kept their document inside a double-layered bamboo tube sealed with wax, checking it regularly to make sure the ink had not faded. The girl learned early that forgetting any detail of these rules could mean losing the right to fish in the better channels. Daily routines included many small skills that built quietly over the years. She became expert at using a long bamboo pole to push the boat through shallow mud flats at low tide, feeling the bottom for hidden rocks that could damage the hull. She helped her mother mix the thick paste used to seal cracks in the planks, learning the exact proportion of tung oil and powdered lime that would harden without cracking again. These tasks filled the hours between fishing and selling, turning idle moments into steady practice. One storm season when she was 11 stands out clearly in the shared family memory. The sky turned the colour of iron and the wind rose so quickly that boats scrambled to tie themselves together in a protected creek. The family lashed their sampan to 3 neighbouring vessels using the strongest ropes they owned. Rain beat down for hours, and the children huddled under the woven mats while the adults took turns bailing water that leaked through the seams. After the wind died, the group spent the next 2 days helping each other untangle lines and patch torn coverings. The experience left her with a lasting respect for the power of the weather and a habit of watching the horizon line every morning for the first hint of change. Economic conditions tightened as she reached her early teens. More tanker boats crowded the same fishing grounds, and some families began carrying small cargoes of salt or dried goods for merchants to supplement their income. Her parents discussed these options in low voices at night, weighing the risks of being accused of smuggling against the need for steady money. The girl listened and began to form her own ideas about how to bring in extra coins. She started saving the few copper pieces she received for helping unload catches at market, hiding them inside a hollow section of bamboo that she kept under her sleeping mat. The habit of careful saving stayed with her long after childhood. Her growing sharpness showed in the way she handled bargaining at the floating markets. Merchants from land villages would come alongside in their own small boats, calling out offers for the day's catch. She learned to remember the voice and face of each regular buyer, noting who paid promptly and who tried to shortchange the weight. This attention to detail helped her family avoid losses and gradually improved their position among the other boats in their cluster. The work gave her a sense of quiet satisfaction, a feeling that she could influence the family's fortunes through her own efforts. The culture of the boat people included simple games that children played during quiet hours. They would toss polished shells or small stones back and forth across the gap between moored vessels, keeping score in their heads. The girl enjoyed these games because they sharpened her eye and her memory at the same time. She also picked up fragments of songs that older women sang while mending nets, melodies that rose and fell with the rhythm of the work. These songs spoke of calm seas and safe returns, words that comforted everyone when the weather turned uncertain. Political decisions made far away in the capital sometimes reached the delta in the form of new taxes or restrictions on movement. During one period, the government ordered tighter controls on all coastal traffic, requiring additional permits for boats travelling between districts. The family had to spend extra days waiting at checkpoints while clerks examined their papers. These delays meant lost fishing time and shorter meals until they could return to their usual waters. The experience taught her that forces beyond the river could still shape the smallest details of daily life. By the time she approached her 16th year, the girl had developed a steady confidence in her own abilities. She could steer through narrow channels at night using only the stars and the sound of the water against the hull. She knew which merchants could be trusted and which channels offered the best shelter in sudden squalls. The close world of the family boat had given her practical knowledge, strong family ties, and a clear understanding of the limits placed on people who lived on the water. These foundations would prove more valuable than anyone on board could have guessed, as her life began to open toward wider possibilities. Flower, boat, life. The wider possibilities opened when she reached her late teens and the family faced increasing pressure from shrinking fishing grounds and rising costs for boat maintenance. Discussions on the family sampan turned toward the idea of her moving to one of the larger flower boats that operated in the busier sections of the Pearl River near Guangzhou. These vessels were known locally as flower boats because of the colourful lanterns and decorations that hung from their decks at night. For many tanker girls, this represented a way to earn money that could support the family back on the water. She made the move around the age of 16 or 17, joining a 2-decked flower boat moored in one of the crowded clusters along the riverfront. The boat itself measured perhaps 60 feet long, with carved wooden railings painted in red and gold, glass windows fitted into the upper cabins, and lanterns strung along the sides that glowed softly after dark. Lower decks held the working areas and small sleeping quarters for the women, while the upper level featured private rooms for clients complete with low tables, cushions and musical instruments. The air always carried a mix of incense, rice wine, and the river's muddy scent, especially strong when the tide turned. Her first weeks involved learning the routines that kept the boat running smoothly. Older women showed her how to apply the light makeup used on these vessels: powdered cheeks, darkened eyebrows, and a touch of rouge on the lips. They taught her the proper way to pour tea or wine without spilling, how to hold a peeper so the strings produced clear notes, and how to keep conversation flowing without revealing too much personal information. Clients expected entertainment as much as anything else, and the women competed quietly to master these skills. She practiced daily during quiet afternoon hours when the boat rocked gently at its moorings. The flower boat community formed its own floating neighbourhood. Boats anchored side by side created narrow lanes of water where smaller sampans delivered fresh supplies of fruit, steamed buns, or bolts of silk. Women from different vessels exchanged news and small favours, passing packets of hairpins or sharing remedies for the coughs that spread easily in the damp air. Owners of the boats, often older women who had worked their way up, managed the accounts and decided which clients received invitations. Payment came in silver taels or foreign coins brought by merchants, and a portion always went back to the family on the fishing sampan. Client interactions followed set patterns that varied by the time of year and the trading season. During the busy months when foreign ships waited at Whampoa downstream, Chinese merchants and officials arrived in the evenings after their daytime business. Some came alone for quiet conversation and music. Others brought small groups for banquets that lasted late into the night. She learned to recognize the types quickly: the quiet scholar who wanted poetry recited, the loud trader who preferred gambling games with dice, the military officer who spoke little but tipped generously. High-ranking visitors sometimes included court officials travelling through Guangzhou or wealthy salt merchants from inland provinces. Her reputation grew steadily because she remembered faces and preferences, offering the right song or story at the right moment. Daily life settled into a steady rhythm that balanced work and rest. Mornings started with cleaning the cabins, wiping down the wooden floors, and airing out the bedding. Midday brought time for meals shared among the women, bowls of congee with pickled vegetables or fresh fish bought from passing boats. Afternoons involved sewing or embroidery when no clients were expected, tasks that kept hands busy and produced small items for sale. Evenings brought the lanterns to life and the arrival of guests, with music drifting across the water until the small hours. Sleep came in short stretches on narrow bunks, interrupted by the sounds of oars and the occasional call of night watchmen on nearby vessels. The culture on the flower boats included its own set of traditions and superstitions. Women burned incense at small altars dedicated to Tin Hau each morning, asking for protection from disease or sudden storms that could damage the boats. They avoided certain words during conversations with clients, believing that speaking of bad luck could invite it. Clothing reflected the need to appear elegant yet practical: silk robes, in soft colours that could be changed quickly between visitors, hair styled in elaborate knots held with combs and pins. Jewellery arrived as gifts from satisfied clients: silver bracelets, jade earrings, or small hair ornaments that added to a woman's personal collection. Economic realities shaped every decision. The boat owner took a large share of earnings, leaving the women with enough to send money home and save for their own futures. Some used their savings to buy freedom from the boat or to help relatives purchase better fishing gear. Others invested in small businesses on shore, such as selling cloth or opening tea stalls. She developed a careful approach to money, tracking each tale in her mind and noting which clients paid reliably. This habit of quiet calculation served her well. As the years passed and her position on the boat became more secure, interactions with the wider harbour world added layers to daily experience. Foreign traders from the 13 factories sometimes visited the flower boats, though Chinese regulations tried to limit such contact. Their presence brought news of distant places, accounts of ships from Britain or America, descriptions of goods like clocks and wool that arrived in the trading season. Local officials patrolled the river periodically, collecting fees or checking for unlicensed activity. The women learned to spot approaching patrol boats by the sound of their drums and prepared small gifts of wine or sweets to smooth any inspections. Her growing skill with people showed in the way she handled difficult situations. When a client became overly demanding, she could redirect the conversation with a well-timed story or song. When arguments broke out among visitors, she knew how to calm the mood without appearing to take sides. These abilities drew notice from boat owners and regular clients alike. Merchants began requesting her company specifically, and some sent advance messages with gifts to secure an evening. The recognition brought extra income and a measure of respect within the floating community. Seasons changed the boat's atmosphere in noticeable ways. Summer brought heavy rains that required constant bailing and extra tarps over the decks. Winter meant thicker robes and braziers filled with charcoal to warm the cabins. Festival times, such as the Lantern Festival or the Dragon Boat races, increased business as crowds gathered along the river. During these periods, the women prepared special performances, group songs or dances that attracted larger parties. The extra work left everyone tired, but also provided opportunities to earn more than usual. Social bonds among the women strengthened through shared routines. They helped each other with hairstyles that required extra hands, shared medicines when someone fell ill, and offered advice on dealing with particular clients. Stories passed quietly at night about women who had left the boats to marry or start shops on land. These tales reminded everyone that the work, while steady, remained temporary for those who planned carefully. She listened closely and began forming her own quiet ambitions about what might come after this phase of life. The precarious side appeared in occasional outbreaks of illness that spread through the crowded boats or in sudden drops in. Business. When new government restrictions limited river traffic, owners sometimes sold boats or changed routes, forcing women to adapt quickly. Yet within these uncertainties, she built a reputation for reliability and sharp observation. Clients valued her ability to listen without judgment and to remember small details about their lives. This combination of warmth and quiet intelligence set her apart in a profession where many competed for attention. By her early 20s, she had become one of the better-known figures among the flower boats in her section of the river. Regular visitors spoke of her poise and quick mind, and word spread through the merchant networks that connected Guangzhou to other ports. The skills she had learned on the family fishing boat, reading people, managing resources, staying calm under pressure now served her in new ways. The river continued its constant flow around the anchored boats, carrying news and opportunities with every tide. These years on, the flower boats added layers of experience that would prove useful far beyond the lantern-lit decks and the gentle rocking of the Pearl River. Encounter with Zheng Yi was during one of those lantern-lit evenings in the year 1801 that the course of her life shifted in a way no one on the flower boats could have predicted. News had been travelling up and down the Pearl River for months about growing numbers of armed junks operating just beyond the delta. Clients spoke in lowered voices of merchant ships that vanished after leaving Guangzhou, of fishing villages that paid regular tribute to avoid raids, and of a new generation of pirate leaders who moved with more organisation than the scattered bands of earlier decades. The Qing Navy, stretched thin by inland rebellions and budget cuts from the capital, could rarely spare enough warships to patrol the outer waters effectively. This left the South China Sea open for those who knew how to use speed, numbers, and local knowledge. Zheng Yi had already built a reputation as one of the most capable of these leaders. Born into a family with long ties to coastal raiding, he had spent his youth learning the currents around the Gulf of Tonkin and the islands farther south. By his mid-30s, he commanded a growing squadron of fast junks, each crewed by men who followed strict orders and shared in the profits. He was not the wild outlaw of popular stories. Instead, he He operated like a careful businessman of the sea, choosing targets that yielded steady income without drawing too much attention from the imperial authorities. His ships flew red flags as their identifying mark, a simple signal that allowed his captains to recognize one another across wide stretches of water. One evening, a messenger sampan pulled alongside the flower boat, carrying word that a group of men from the outer fleet wished to spend time aboard. The owner prepared extra wine and arranged the best upper cabin. When Zheng Yi stepped onto the deck, he stood out even among the usual merchants and officials. He wore practical sea clothing, dark trousers reinforced at the knees, a loose tunic of heavy cotton, and a short jacket that showed the wear of salt air and sun. His face carried the lines of someone who had spent years scanning horizons, and he moved with the balanced gait of a man accustomed to rolling decks. He carried no obvious weapons that night, but everyone on the boat understood that his presence alone commanded respect. She was assigned to entertain him and his small group of officers. The evening began in the usual way, with tea served in fine porcelain cups and music on the peeper. Zheng Yi listened quietly at first, asking occasional questions about the river traffic she observed daily from the flower boat. He wanted details on which foreign ships were loading tea and opium, how many guards accompanied the salt convoys, and which officials took bribes to look the other way. She answered directly, drawing on years of watching the same patterns. Her replies were clear and measured, never exaggerated, and she noticed how he weighed each piece of information before moving to the next topic. As the night progressed, the conversation turned to the realities of life on the water. Zheng Yi described the loose alliance he was forming with other captains, explaining how shared signals and agreed-upon territories could turn individual raids into a reliable system. He spoke of the need for someone who understood both the river ports and the open sea, someone who could calculate risks the way merchants calculated profits. She listened without interrupting, her mind turning over the possibilities. The flower boat life had given her steady income and a measure of independence, yet it remained bounded by the same channels and the same clients year after year. The pirate world he described offered movement, larger stakes, and the chance to shape outcomes rather than simply react to them. Over the following weeks, Zheng Yi returned several times. Each visit followed a similar pattern, business talk mixed with quiet observation of how she managed the evening. He noticed her habit of remembering small details, names of captains, types of cargo, even the timing of tides, and saw how she used that knowledge to keep the boat running smoothly. For her part, she observed his steadiness under pressure. When one of his officers became loud after too much wine, Zheng Yi calmed the man with a single quiet word and a steady look. He paid generously and on time, treating the women with the same respect he showed his own crew. These repeated visits built a quiet understanding between them, grounded in shared knowledge of the water and a mutual recognition of practical intelligence. The political situation in the wider region continued to favour such arrangements. The Qing court, focused on containing the White Lotus rebellion far inland, had reduced naval spending and left coastal defence to underfunded local garrisons. Pirates who avoided direct attacks on imperial warships could operate for years with little interference. Zheng Yi's growing fleet benefited from this gap, drawing experienced sailors from fishing villages and even some former soldiers who preferred the sea life. He offered steady shares of loot, medical care for the wounded, and protection for their families on shore. This structure attracted capable men and created a network that stretched from Vietnam northward along the Chinese coast. She weighed her own position carefully during those weeks. The money she sent back to her family had improved their fishing boat, but she knew the work on the flower boat would eventually take its toll. Marriage to a land official was unlikely given her background, and remaining single carried its own risks as she aged. Zheng Yi's proposal, when it came, arrived during a quiet evening after his officers had left the cabin. He offered more than the usual arrangement of a temporary union common among boat people. He suggested a full marriage in which she would join him on his flagship and share equally in decisions about the fleet. The terms included her right to command during his absences and an equal division of any captured goods. These conditions were unusual, yet they matched the practical partnership both recognized as necessary for success. The surrounding circumstances made the match logical for both sides. Zheng Yi needed a partner who understood the river economy and could manage the complex logistics of supplying a large fleet. She needed a path out of the flower boats that offered security and influence. The coastal culture of the time accepted such unions among seafaring people, where practical skills mattered more than formal status. Within the tanker community, marriages that strengthened alliances between boats or groups were common. Extending that idea to a pirate squadron felt like a natural step in the fluid world of the Delta. Preparations for the union moved quickly once the agreement was set. Zheng Yi arranged a simple ceremony aboard one of his junks, with witnesses from both his crew and the flower boat community. She brought her modest savings and a few personal items, including the silver bracelets accumulated over the years. The owner of the flower boat received a generous payment that released her from any remaining obligations. News of the marriage spread along the river within days, carried by the same messenger boats that delivered supplies and gossip. Some viewed it as a clever business arrangement. Others saw it as the beginning of something larger in the pirate world. Her transition from the flower boat to the pirate fleet happened without fanfare. She moved her belongings onto Zheng Yi's flagship, a sturdy junk with reinforced hulls and space for both living quarters and planning meetings. The daily rhythm changed immediately. Instead of pouring wine for clients, she began learning the signals used between ships and the methods for dividing captured cargo fairly. Zheng Yi introduced her to his key captains, explaining her role in clear terms so there would be no confusion about authority. She observed how the crew respected the chain of command, and how disputes were settled quickly according to agreed rules. The factors that drew them together extended beyond personal attraction. Both understood the limits of the old ways, the shrinking fishing grounds for tanker families, the unpredictable income on flower boats, the weak grip of the Qing Navy on the outer seas. Together they saw an opportunity to build something more stable than the scattered raids of previous generations. She brought her experience with merchants and river traffic. He brought his knowledge of open water navigation and fleet coordination. The partnership formed on those early visits proved practical from the start, setting the stage for the rapid expansion that would follow. Life aboard the flagship introduced new routines that blended the familiar with the unknown. Meals still featured rice and fish, but now prepared in larger quantities for the crew. Clothing shifted to heavier garments suited for spray and wind, though she kept a few of her silk robes for meetings with local contacts. Evenings often involved quiet discussions about the next day's movements rather than music for clients. She maintained her habit of careful observation, noting wind patterns, crew morale, and the reliability of each captain. Zheng Yi valued these insights, and their shared decision-making became a regular part of fleet operations. The coastal world they inhabited was changing around them. More villages along the Guangdong and Fujian coasts began paying regular protection fees rather than risk raids. Foreign traders at Guangzhou complained in their reports about lost cargoes, yet the trade continued because the profits remained high. Qing officials occasionally launched small expeditions against pirate bases, but these efforts rarely reached the main squadrons. Within this environment, Zheng Yi's fleet grew steadily, and her role within it solidified. The encounter that began on the flower boat had opened a path she could never have planned from the decks of her family's sampan. Yet every step felt like a logical extension of the skills she had built over the years. Marriage to the pirate. The ceremony itself took place on a calm afternoon in late 1801 aboard Zheng Yi's flagship, a broad-beamed junk anchored in a sheltered inlet south of Macau. No elaborate decorations marked the occasion. The deck had been swept clean. A small table held bowls of rice wine and steamed buns, and a handful of trusted captains served as witnesses. A local Taoist priest from a nearby fishing village performed the brief rites, burning incense and reciting standard blessings for harmony and prosperity at sea. She wore one of her better silk robes from the flower boat days, the deep green fabric folded neatly, her hair pinned simply. Zheng Yi stood beside her in his usual sea attire, only adding a short red sash as a nod to the day. The entire event lasted less than an hour, after which the crew returned to their regular duties and the couple moved below to the captain's cabin to begin their shared command. The shift in her daily existence came swiftly. The flower boat had been a stationary world of fixed moorings and predictable rhythms. Now the flagship moved constantly along the coast, following wind and tide. She learned the layout of the vessel quickly, the narrow companionways, the storage holds packed with rice and dried fish, the small cabin where maps and ledgers were kept. The space she shared with Zheng Yi measured perhaps 8 feet by 10, fitted with a low wooden bed platform, a folding table, and shelves for personal items. A single lantern hung from the beam overhead, its light swaying with the motion of the ship. She arranged her few belongings, silver bracelets, a jade comb, a small box of saved coins on one side, creating a quiet corner that felt like her own. Meals followed the pattern of the crew. Breakfast came early, usually congee with pickled radish and tea brewed strong to cut through the morning chill. Lunch and dinner were rice with whatever the fishing boats brought fresh catch when available, salted fish or dried shrimp otherwise. Zheng Yi ate with the senior officers most days, discussing the next move while they shared bowls. She joined these meals when the discussion turned to matters she could speak on directly: the reliability of certain merchants, the timing of tribute payments from coastal villages, the patterns of Qing patrol boats. Her contributions were practical and brief. The men listened because Zheng Yi made it clear that her word carried the same weight as his. The marriage gave her immediate access to the inner workings of the fleet. Zheng Yi had already gathered about 200 junks under his loose command, most operating out of hidden anchorages along the Guangdong and Fujian coasts. Each captain retained control of his own ship and crew, but agreed to coordinate attacks and share intelligence. Meetings took place on the flagship or on larger vessels when the squadron gathered. She attended these from the beginning, seated beside Zheng Yi at the low table where charts were spread. She noted how he balanced firmness with fairness, rewarding successful raids with larger shares, settling disputes by hearing both sides, and enforcing rules that prevented unnecessary cruelty. She began keeping mental records of each captain's strengths and weaknesses, information she later used to suggest which vessels should pair for certain operations. Personal adjustments required steady attention. Seasickness never troubled her, a holdover from childhood on the family sampan, but the constant motion meant learning to sleep through the creak of timbers and the slap of waves. She developed the habit of rising before dawn to check the weather from the deck, watching the colour of the sky and the direction of the wind. Zheng Yi appreciated this routine and often joined her, the two of them standing in silence as the first light appeared. These quiet moments became part of their shared life, a time when plans could be discussed without interruption. The fleet's operations brought new social layers. Crew members came from varied backgrounds: former fishermen, discharged soldiers, runaway labourers, even some minor gentry sons who had fallen into debt. Many had families in coastal villages who depended on the monthly remittances sent back from captured goods. She made it a point to speak with the men who handled supplies, learning how much rice and salt each junk needed, how often sails required replacement, and what medicines were hardest to obtain. This knowledge helped when planning longer voyages. She could calculate provisions accurately and avoid shortages that had weakened other squadrons in the past. Relations with coastal communities formed another daily reality. Villages that paid regular tribute received protection from rival groups and warning of approaching Qing patrols. In return, they supplied fresh water, vegetables, and information. She accompanied Zheng Yi on several visits to these settlements, walking the dirt paths between thatched houses while villagers brought baskets of rice and dried fruit as tokens of goodwill. She observed how the headmen negotiated quietly, asking for lower payments during lean seasons, offering extra intelligence when Qing officials grew active. Her presence as Zheng Yi's wife added weight to these exchanges. Villagers saw her as someone who understood their concerns and could influence decisions. Within the fleet, she maintained a measured distance from the crew. She never raised her voice or issued orders directly unless necessary, preferring to work through Zheng Yi or the senior captains. yet her authority became clear in small ways. When a dispute arose over the division of captured cloth, she suggested a method of sorting by quality and distributing evenly, a system that ended the argument quickly. When illness spread through one junk, she organized the transfer of herbal medicines from the flagship and arranged for the sick men to rest ashore under guard. These actions built respect without requiring displays of force. The couple's partnership extended to strategic planning. Zheng Yi focused on the mechanics of raids, timing, approach, boarding tactics. She contributed by analyzing the economic side, which trade routes carried the richest cargoes, which merchants could afford to pay protection money without bankrupting themselves, how to maintain steady income even during the off-season for foreign trade. Together they mapped out a system of tribute zones along the coast, dividing the area so each captain had a defined stretch to patrol and collect from. This reduced conflict among the Allied ships and created a more predictable revenue stream. Life at sea included its own small habits and routines. Zheng Yi kept a personal ledger where he recorded major captures and payments, a practice she adopted and expanded. She began noting details. He overlooked names of reliable local suppliers, patterns in Ching Shih movements, even the preferences of key merchants who could be persuaded to provide information. These records stayed in a sealed bamboo tube kept in their cabin, safe from salt air and spray. She also maintained her earlier habit of saving a portion of every share, storing the coins and small ingots in hidden compartments she built into the cabin walls. The marriage brought a sense of shared purpose that went beyond personal attachment. Both understood that survival in this world depended on clear division of responsibilities and mutual trust. Zheng Yi handled the outward command, the signals between ships, the choice of targets, the negotiations with other pirate leaders. She managed the inward details, the provisioning, the morale of the crews, the long-term stability of the alliance. This balance allowed the fleet to grow without the internal fractures that had destroyed earlier pirate groups. Daily interactions with the crew revealed more about the human side of the operation. Men told stories of their villages during quiet watches, spoke of children they had not seen in months, shared remedies passed down from grandmothers for seasickness or wounds. She listened and remembered these details, using them later to assign men to tasks that suited their skills, or to send small gifts back to families when possible. These small gestures helped maintain loyalty in a world where desertion remained a constant risk. The broader political forces continued to shape their world. The Qing court, still dealing with rebellions in central China, offered little sustained pressure on the southern coast. Local officials preferred to collect bribes rather than risk open conflict with a well-armed fleet. This tacit arrangement allowed Zheng Yi's squadron to expand steadily, adding new captains who saw the benefits of joining a larger, more organized force. Each new addition strengthened their position and increased the resources available for operations. By the end of their first year together, the fleet had grown to include more than 400 vessels, with thousands of men under loose but effective coordination. She had become an integral part of the leadership, her role recognized by every captain and most of the crew. The transition from flower boat to flagship had been complete, yet she carried forward the same careful observation and practical thinking that had served her on the river. The marriage to Zheng Yi had not only changed her circumstances, it had given her a platform from which to exercise the abilities she had developed over years of watching people and patterns on the water. Building the confederation the years following the marriage saw the fleet expand at a pace that surprised even those who had watched Zheng Yi's early rise. What began as a loose collection of Allied junks, perhaps 400 or 500 vessels in 1801, grew into a coordinated force numbering closer to 1,000 ships by 1805. The structure that made this possible relied on agreements that went beyond simple promises of mutual aid. Zheng Yi and his wife worked together to formalize the arrangement, turning scattered captains into members of what later sources described as the Guangdong Pirate Confederation. The political environment of the Qing Empire during these years created ideal conditions for such growth. The Jiaqing Emperor had inherited a treasury drained by the costly suppression of the White Lotus Rebellion, which dragged on until 1804. Military spending focused on central and northern provinces left southern coastal defences underfunded and undermanned. Local governors in Guangdong and Fujian received orders to maintain order but lacked the ships, trained sailors, and consistent pay to mount serious campaigns against well-organised pirates. This gap allowed Zheng Yi's group to operate with relative freedom, collecting tribute from villages and merchants who had little faith in imperial protection. The confederation took shape through a series of meetings held in hidden anchorages, narrow bays shielded by islands, mangrove-lined creeks, or shallow lagoons where larger junks could not easily follow. Zheng Yi invited captains one by one or in small groups, explaining the advantages of joining. Each leader retained command of his own vessels and crew, kept his red flag as an identifier, and continued to choose his targets within an assigned coastal zone. In return, the captains agreed to several core rules: share intelligence on Qing movements, coordinate major operations when needed, divide captured goods according to a fixed scale, and pay a small percentage of monthly tribute into a central fund used for repairs, medicine, and support for injured men or widows. She played a direct role in these negotiations. While Zheng Yi handled the broader strategy and the personal authority that came with his reputation, she focused on the practical details that made the system workable. She asked captains about their current tribute arrangements, how much rice and salt their crews consumed in a typical month, and what problems they faced with desertion or supply shortages. These questions revealed patterns. Some captains struggled with unreliable local suppliers, others lost men to illness because they lacked basic medicines. She proposed solutions that addressed these issues directly: a rotating schedule for fishing boats to deliver provisions to the fleet, a shared stockpile of herbal remedies kept on the flagship, and a system for transferring wounded men to shore villages that had agreed to provide care in exchange for lower tribute rates. The Confederation divided the coastline into 6 main districts, each under a senior captain known as a flag leader. The Red Flag Fleet, under Zheng Yi himself, operated in the central zone around the Pearl River Delta and Macau. Other flags, black, yellow, blue, white, and green, covered adjacent stretches from Hainan Island northward toward Fujian. Each flag leader reported monthly on tribute collected, vessels added or lost, and any encounters with Qing forces. These reports came in written form when possible, carried by fast sampans, or delivered verbally during gatherings. She helped establish a simple code for these communications, using numbers for ship counts, place names replaced with landmarks known only to the group, and dates written in a private calendar that shifted the lunar months to confuse outsiders. Daily life across the Confederation reflected this growing organization. Larger junks served as floating warehouses, carrying surplus rice, dried fish, and bolts of cloth taken in raids. Smaller vessels acted as scouts, moving ahead of the main fleet to watch for merchant convoys or imperial patrols. Crews rotated through shore leave in friendly villages, where they could visit families and rest on solid ground. The central fund paid for new sails, cannon repairs, and even small pensions for men who lost limbs or eyes in boarding actions. These measures reduced the constant turnover that had plagued earlier pirate groups, allowing experienced sailors to stay rather than scatter after a single good season. Relations with coastal populations evolved under the Confederation's rules. Villages that paid regularly received clear benefits: warning of approaching Qing tax collectors, protection from smaller rival bands, and occasional help during storms or lean harvests. Headmen met with flag leaders at agreed landing points, bringing baskets of rice or pigs as part of the tribute, and receiving receipts in return, simple bamboo slips marked with the fleet's seal. She encouraged this paperwork because it created accountability on both sides. A village that paid on time could appeal directly if a captain overstepped the agreed amount. The Confederation also developed mechanisms to handle internal disputes. When 2 captains claimed the same merchant ship or argued over a captured cargo, the matter went before Zheng Yi and his wife for judgment. She often suggested compromises based on precedent, splitting the value evenly, assigning the ship to the captain who first sighted it, but requiring him to share a portion of future tribute. These decisions, delivered calmly and consistently, prevented feuds that could have fractured the alliance. Economic pressures from the wider world continued to feed the fleet's growth. The Canton trade system brought increasing numbers of foreign ships to Whampoa anchorage. British, American, Portuguese, Dutch, each carrying silver, woolens and opium in exchange for tea, silk, and porcelain. Many merchants preferred to pay protection money rather than risk losing an entire cargo. Zheng Yi's scouts tracked these vessels, noting departure dates and routes. The Confederation then sent squadrons to intercept them in open water, boarding only when resistance seemed weak. Captured goods were auctioned among the crews or sold through trusted brokers in coastal markets, with proceeds divided according to rank and participation. She took particular interest in the opium trade that grew steadily during these years. British merchants imported increasing quantities from India, and local smugglers distributed the drug inland. Some pirate junks began escorting opium cargoes for a fee, providing armed protection against rivals or corrupt officials. This sideline brought steady silver without the risks of direct seizure, and she helped organise the schedules so that escort duties did not interfere with regular tribute collection. The Confederation's expansion drew new captains who saw the advantages of membership. Experienced leaders from Hainan and the Leizhou Peninsula brought their own squadrons, adding hundreds of vessels at a time. Each brought local knowledge, hidden coves, safe channels, trusted contacts in villages that strengthened the overall network. She made sure these newcomers received fair shares of tribute zones and equal access to the central fund, preventing resentment among the older members. Crew composition reflected the diverse coastal population. Men from tanker families joined alongside Cantonese villagers, Hakka labourers, and even some Manchu bannermen who had deserted their posts. Women sometimes sailed with the fleet wives of captains, cooks, or those who handled mending and medical care. She maintained contact with these women, ensuring they received supplies and that their voices reached the leadership when needed. This attention to the human side helped sustain morale across the growing force. By 1806, the Confederation controlled much of the shipping along the Guangdong coast. Merchants adjusted their routes and insurance rates to account for the presence of red flag junks. Qing officials in Guangzhou issued proclamations condemning the pirates but mounted few serious expeditions. The occasional naval patrol, small squadrons of war junks usually withdrew after token exchanges of cannon fire. These limited clashes reinforced the Confederation's reputation without inflicting serious losses. Zheng Yi and his wife continued their routine of shared command. Mornings often found them on deck, reviewing scout reports and planning the next month's movements. Evenings brought meetings with flag leaders or quiet hours in the cabin going over ledgers. She maintained her habit of careful saving, setting aside a portion of every major capture for a personal reserve. Zheng Yi respected this practice and followed a similar approach, understanding that security in their line of work required preparation for uncertain times. The Confederation represented more than a pirate alliance. It functioned as a shadow administration along the coast, collecting revenue, enforcing rules, and providing services that the Qing state could not or would not deliver. This parallel structure allowed it to endure and expand even as the empire focused elsewhere. The partnership between Zheng Yi and his wife remained the central axis, his outward authority complemented by her inward management, creating a stability that drew more captains and more vessels each season. The fleet that had started as a regional force now influenced trade and politics across hundreds of miles of coastline, setting the stage for the events that would test its cohesion in the years ahead. Life aboard the junks. The junks that formed the backbone of the Confederation varied in size and build, yet they shared certain features that shaped the daily existence of everyone who lived and worked on them. Most measured between 60 and 100 feet in length, with high curved sterns and broad hulls designed to carry heavy loads across shallow coastal waters. The larger flagships, like the one Zheng Yi and his wife commanded, carried 3 masts and multiple decks, while smaller scout vessels relied on 2 masts and a single open deck. Hulls were constructed from fir or camphor wood, coated repeatedly with tung oil to resist rot from constant exposure to salt. Bamboo battens reinforced the sails, which were dyed reddish-brown to match the identifying flags flown from the mastheads. A typical day began in the grey light before sunrise. The watch on deck struck a wooden gong to rouse the crew. Men rolled out of hammocks slung between beams, or from thin mats spread on the deck. Those who had slept below came up through narrow hatches, blinking against the sudden brightness. Breakfast followed quickly. Large pots of congee cooked over charcoal stoves lashed securely in the galley area. Cooks ladled the thick rice porridge into wooden bowls, adding whatever was available: dried shrimp, pickled mustard greens, or small pieces of salt fish. Tea brewed in iron kettles passed hand to hand, strong and unsweetened. Zheng Yi and his wife ate on the quarterdeck with the senior officers, bowls balanced on knees while they reviewed the night's scout reports. Clothing suited the demands of sea work and weather. Crew members wore loose trousers of heavy cotton that could be rolled above the knees when swabbing decks or handling lines. Tunics reached mid-thigh, sleeves tied back during labour. Most went barefoot, soles toughened by years on salt-wet planks. In colder months, or during night watches, men added short jackets padded with cotton wadding. Zheng Yi favoured dark colours that showed less dirt. His wife kept a few finer pieces from her earlier life, but wore practical sea garb most days: wide trousers, a long tunic belted at the waist, and a conical hat of woven palm leaves when the sun stood high. Head coverings doubled as protection from spray. Some men tied cloth bands around their foreheads to keep sweat from their eyes. Superstitions guided many small habits aboard the junks. No one whistled after dark, believing the sound could call up winds that would drive the ship onto rocks. Cats were welcomed for their skill at catching rats, but black ones were avoided on new voyages. When a man died at sea, his body received a quick burial wrapped in sailcloth, with coins placed under the tongue to pay the ferryman in the afterlife. Small shrines to Tin Hao stood on every vessel, usually a wooden tablet set in a niche at the bow, draped with red cloth and tended daily with fresh incense. Before a major raid or during a storm, the crew gathered to burn paper offerings and pour wine over the side, asking for calm seas and safe returns. Daily routines divided cleanly between labour and rest. Morning hours brought scrubbing of decks with salt water carried in buckets, checking of rigging for frayed lines, and repairs to sails torn in the previous day's wind. Men worked in teams, passing tools hand over hand without needing many words. The cook and his assistants prepared the midday meal: steamed fish, when fresh catch arrived from accompanying fishing boats, or rice with preserved vegetables otherwise. Afternoons often involved lookout duties or maintenance of weapons, sharpening cutlasses, oiling matchlocks, cleaning cannon barrels with ramrods and wet rags. In quieter periods, men mended nets, carved bone dice, or played simple games with cards made from scraps of paper. Interactions with coastal villages occurred regularly. Small boats rowed out from shore carrying baskets of sweet potatoes, taro, eggs, or live chickens as part of tribute payments. In return, pirate junks delivered salt, iron tools, or bolts of cloth taken in captures. When a village headman needed to speak directly with the leadership, he came aboard the flagship under a white flag of truce. Zheng Yi and his wife received these visitors on the quarterdeck, listening to requests for lower tribute during poor harvests or for help against rival gangs. Decisions came after brief discussion. The wife often suggested adjustments based on the village's past reliability, and Zheng Yi confirmed them. These exchanges kept the coastal economy tied to the fleet in a way that benefited both sides. The flagship itself served as the nerve centre. Its main deck held space for meetings, with a large low table where charts could be spread and lanterns hung at night. Below decks, storage compartments held rice sacks, barrels of water, and crates of captured goods waiting for division. The couple's cabin remained small but orderly. a sleeping platform covered with woven mats, a folding table for writing, shelves holding ledgers, and the sealed bamboo tube of personal savings. A single porthole let in light and air. At night, a lantern provided the only illumination. She kept the space clean, wiping surfaces daily to prevent mould, a habit carried over from her flowerboat years. Crew relations followed a clear hierarchy tempered by practical necessity. Senior officers ate first and received larger shares of loot, yet every man who participated in a boarding action got a portion regardless of rank. Disputes over shares or duties went to Zheng Yi for judgment. His decisions stuck because they rested on consistent rules rather than favoritism. Punishments for theft or desertion were swift flogging for minor offences, expulsion, or worse for serious breaches. But such cases remained rare once the Confederation's stability became clear. Men who showed skill in navigation, gunnery, or carpentry rose quickly, earning respect from their peers. Food supplies required constant attention. Fishing boats attached to the fleet cast nets daily, bringing in mackerel, squid, or shrimp to supplement the stores. When provisions ran low, junks anchored near friendly villages to trade or requisition what was needed. Water came from shore springs or collected rainwater funneled into barrels during the wet season. The wife oversaw the rotation of supplies between vessels, ensuring no single junk ran short while others hoarded. This system prevented the hunger that had weakened other pirate groups in the past. Evenings brought a shift in pace. After the day's labour, men gathered in small groups to talk, smoke pipes filled with cheap tobacco, or listen to someone play a two-stringed fiddle. Songs rose occasionally, old ballads from fishing villages or new verses composed about recent raids. Zheng Yi sometimes joined these gatherings briefly, sharing a pipe or a cup of wine before returning to the cabin. His wife preferred quieter hours, reviewing the day's records or planning the next week's movements. The two often discussed details late into the night. Lanterns turned low, voices kept soft against the creak of the hull and the lap of water. The presence of women on some junks added another layer to shipboard life. A few captains brought wives or concubines. Others allowed female relatives to sail during calm seasons. These women handled cooking, mending, and basic medical care, applying poultices to wounds, brewing herbal teas for fevers. The wife of the overall commander maintained contact with them, making sure they received cloth for clothing and medicines when available. This small network helped sustain morale, especially among men who had left families ashore. Health remained a constant concern in the close quarters of the junks. Damp conditions bred coughs and skin infections. Wounds from boarding actions could turn septic without proper care. The fleet carried a limited stock of Chinese medicines, dried herbs, ginseng root, tiger bone powder, kept in sealed jars. When serious cases arose, injured men went ashore to trusted healers in protected villages. Preventive measures included daily airing of bedding and strict rules against wasting fresh water. The wife insisted on these habits, drawing from her knowledge of how illness spread in crowded spaces. The rhythm of life aboard the junks balanced the demands of survival with moments of ordinary human routine. Men repaired gear, shared meals, told stories, and watched the same sea that had shaped their lives from childhood. Zheng Yi and his wife moved through this world with steady purpose, his authority visible in every command, hers in the quiet details that kept the fleet functioning day after day. The junks carried them forward across the South China Sea, a floating society held together by shared risk, shared rules, and the constant motion of water beneath the hulls. Raids and tribute. The Confederation's daily operations rested on two main sources of income: direct raids on merchant vessels and the more steady collection of tribute from coastal settlements and passing traders. Both methods required careful planning and execution to maintain the fleet's size and cohesion without provoking a sustained Qing response that could overwhelm them. Raids targeted specific types of ships rather than striking at random. Zheng Yi's scouts, fast, lightly armed sampans or small junks, patrolled the main shipping lanes leading in and out of Guangzhou, the approaches to Macau, and the routes along the coast toward Fujian. These scouts noted vessel types, flags, approximate cargo, and the number of armed guards aboard. Reports returned to the flagship within hours or days, depending on distance. Zheng Yi and his wife reviewed these accounts together, marking likely targets on their charts. Large rice transports from the Yangtze Delta, tea junks returning from inland ports, salt barges moving south, or foreign ships carrying silver and woolens from the factories at Whampoa. When a promising target appeared, a squadron of 10 to 30 junks moved into position. They approached under cover of night or fog when possible, using muffled oars and reduced sail to avoid detection. The attacking vessels spread out in a loose crescent formation that allowed them to cut off escape routes. Cannon fire usually came first, aimed at rigging and masts to disable rather than sink, followed by boarding parties armed with grappling hooks, short swords, matchlocks, and spears. Crews trained to move quickly, throw lines, climb aboard, secure the deck, and herd the merchant sailors below. Resistance rarely lasted long. Most merchant ships carried only a handful of guards, and captains preferred surrender to avoid loss of life and cargo. Once control was established, the boarding party searched the hold systematically. Valuable items, silver ingots, bolts of silk, porcelain crates, chests of tea were transferred to the pirate junks using ropes and baskets. Bulkier goods like rice sacks or timber logs sometimes stayed aboard the captured ship if the pirates decided to keep the vessel itself. The merchant captain and officers were questioned briefly about hidden compartments or additional cargo. Those who cooperated faced less harsh treatment. Passengers, especially women or children, were left untouched and often released with their personal belongings. The captured ship was then either burned, if too damaged or slow, added to the fleet, if suitable, or released after payment of a ransom fee. Division of spoils followed fixed rules known to every captain and crewman. The Central Fund took 10% for fleet-wide expenses, repairs, medicine, support for families. The flag leader received a larger share than ordinary captains, who in turn took more than their crew. Individual sailors received portions based on role. Those who first boarded or fought hardest earned bonuses. Zheng Yi and his wife took their command share, but often redirected part of it back into the Central Fund, or to specific needs, such as outfitting new junks or aiding villages hit by typhoons. This practice helped sustain loyalty across the Confederation. Tribute collection provided the more reliable and less risky income stream. Coastal villages and small ports paid monthly or seasonal fees in rice, salt, cash, livestock, or goods. These payments brought protection from pirate raids and from smaller independent gangs that might otherwise prey on them. Collection occurred at designated landing points, quiet beaches or river mouths, where a small detachment from the local flag fleet arrived by sampan or junk. Village headmen met them with prepared baskets or sacks, accompanied by simple written tallies of what was due. The pirate representatives weighed or counted the tribute, issued a receipt on bamboo or paper, and departed without delay. Disputes were rare. Villages that fell behind received warnings rather than immediate force, and headmen could appeal to the flag leader for adjustments during poor harvests. The wife oversaw much of the tribute system's administration. She maintained ledgers tracking each village's payment history, noting which settlements paid promptly and which required reminders. When a headman requested a temporary reduction, perhaps after a flood damaged crops, she reviewed the record and recommended terms to Zheng Yi. These decisions balanced firmness with pragmatism. Villages treated fairly continued to pay and provided intelligence on Qing troop movements or rival pirate activity. Some settlements even sent extra rice or fish during good seasons as a gesture of goodwill, strengthening the informal alliance. Traders who used the coastal routes paid tribute in a similar way. Fishing fleets, salt merchants, and small cargo operators carried wooden plaques or flags issued by the Confederation, signalling their status as protected vessels. These markers allowed them to pass through patrolled waters without interference. In return, they paid a percentage of their cargo value or a flat fee per voyage. Larger merchants sometimes negotiated annual contracts, delivering silver directly to trusted brokers in Guangzhou, who then forwarded it to the fleet through secure channels. This system reduced the need for constant raids and created a predictable revenue flow that supported the Confederation year-round. The Confederation avoided attacking Qing naval vessels whenever possible. When encounters happened, usually small patrol junks straying into Confederation waters, the response focused on evasion or light skirmishes rather than full engagement. Pirate junks carried more cannon and faster sails, allowing them to outmaneuver Imperial ships. If forced to fight, they aimed to disable and escape rather than destroy. Captured Qing sailors were often released after a few days with messages urging officials to avoid unnecessary conflict. These limited clashes kept the Qing response sporadic. Governors preferred to report minor victories or accept bribes, rather than request large reinforcements from the capital. Merchant experiences varied depending on their willingness to pay. Those who carried the Confederation's markers sailed with relative safety, though they still faced the risk of storms or unrelated bandits. Ships that ignored warnings or attempted to run often lost everything. Captured crews told stories that spread quickly through trading networks, tales of disciplined boarding parties, fair treatment for those who surrendered promptly, and swift punishment for resistance. These accounts discouraged defiance and encouraged more merchants to pay tribute rather than risk capture. The wife's role in these operations remained steady and behind the scenes. She calculated tribute totals against fleet expenses, ensuring the central fund stayed solvent. She tracked which captains collected efficiently and which lagged, suggesting adjustments to zones or personnel when needed. Her knowledge of merchant patterns gained from flower boat days helped identify which traders could afford higher payments without collapsing their businesses. This approach prevented overtaxation that might drive merchants to abandon routes altogether. Seasonal patterns influenced both raids and tribute. The trading season from October to March brought more foreign ships and richer cargoes, leading to increased raid activity. Summer typhoons reduced operations, with junks sheltering in protected bays while crews repaired damage and rested. Tribute payments often peaked after harvests in autumn, when villagers had rice and cash to spare. The Confederation adjusted schedules accordingly, pulling back during storms and pressing harder during peak trade months. The combination of raids and tribute created a self-sustaining economy. Raids provided windfalls of silver, silk and porcelain that could be sold or traded for necessities. Tribute supplied steady food, water, and local goods that kept the fleet fed and repaired. Together they supported thousands of men across hundreds of vessels without relying on a single source that could dry up. Villages and merchants adapted to the arrangement, viewing the Confederation as a fact of coastal life less a criminal enterprise than a shadow authority that filled gaps left by the Qing state. Zheng Yi and his wife reviewed these operations in their cabin each evening. Charts lay spread on the table, marked with recent captures and tribute receipts. They discussed which squadrons performed well, which villages needed encouragement, and how to allocate resources for the coming month. These quiet sessions shaped the next day's orders, sent out by fast messengers at dawn. The system they built proved resilient, adapting to weather, Qing pressure, and internal strains while maintaining the steady flow of goods and silver that kept the red flags flying along the coast, personal ties and ambitions. The partnership between Zheng Yi and his wife had settled into a rhythm that suited both their temperaments by the middle years of the Confederation. They spoke little of affection in the way land couples might, but their daily collaboration showed a deeper understanding. Zheng Yi valued her steady judgment on matters of supply and village relations. She appreciated his ability to command loyalty through clear orders and consistent rewards. In the evenings, after the ledgers were closed, they sometimes shared a quiet cup of wine on deck and reviewed the week's events. She noticed how he listened more attentively when she spoke of long-term risks, and he noticed how she never pushed for changes that might unsettle the captains. This mutual respect formed the core of their bond. stronger than any public display could have been. Her inner drive centered on one clear goal, creating lasting security in a world where power could vanish with a single storm or betrayal. From her childhood on the family sampan, she had learned that survival meant planning ahead, saving what little came in, and never relying on luck alone. That habit had grown with her. She kept a personal reserve of silver hidden in the cabin walls, adding to it after every major capture and every tribute payment. The coins and small ingots were counted regularly, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from damp air. She never spoke of this reserve to anyone except Zheng Yi, and even then only in low voices late at night. It represented her private insurance against the day the Confederation might face serious trouble. Fears lived quietly beneath her practical routines. She worried most about internal fractures captains who might grow greedy or turn on one another once Zheng Yi was no longer there to hold the group together. She also feared a sudden shift in Qing policy that could bring a large fleet down from the north. These concerns never showed in her face or voice during meetings. Instead, she channeled them into small, steady actions, strengthening ties with reliable captains, making sure injured men received care, and keeping detailed records that could prove useful if negotiations with officials ever became necessary. The fears sharpened her focus rather than slowing her down. The adoption of Chung Po Tsai became one of the most important personal ties in her life. The boy had been captured around 1799 during one of Zheng Yi's early raids on a fishing fleet near the Leizhou Peninsula. At the time he was about 15, strong for his age, quick with ropes and sails and already familiar with the sea. Zheng Yi saw potential in the young fisherman's son and decided to take him into the fleet rather than release him with the others. Within a year, the boy had proven himself in several boarding actions, showing courage without recklessness. Zheng Yi formally adopted him as a son in a simple ceremony aboard the flagship, giving him the name Chung Po Tsai and treating him as family. She accepted the adoption without hesitation. Chung Po Tsai moved into quarters near the command cabin and began learning the inner workings of the Confederation. She took a direct interest in his training, teaching him how to read basic accounts, how to judge the quality of rice and salt in tribute payments, and how to speak with village headmen in a way that encouraged cooperation. The young man responded well, showing the same practical intelligence she recognized from her own early years. Over time, he became like a son to both of them, carrying messages between ships, leading small squadrons on scouting missions, and earning the respect of older captains through steady performance. Daily interactions with Chung Po Tsai revealed her softer side. She made sure he received extra portions of fresh fish when supplies allowed, and checked that his clothing stayed mended and dry. In quiet moments, she shared stories from her flower boat days, not the details of clients, but the lessons about reading people and remembering small favours. These conversations happened while they worked side by side on deck or in the cabin, never in front of the crew. Chung Po Tsai listened closely and began to copy her habits of careful observation. The bond strengthened the leadership line, giving the Confederation a clear successor if anything happened to Zheng Yi. Her ties to her birth family remained strong even after years at sea. She sent regular payments back to the Pearl River Delta, silver wrapped in cloth, bolts of captured silk, sacks of rice carried by trusted messenger boats. The money allowed her parents and siblings to upgrade their sampan and buy better fishing gear. She never visited in person. The distance and the nature of her new life made that impossible. Instead, she relied on letters written by literate crew members, simple notes asking about health and the catch. Replies came back with news of births, marriages, and the latest river gossip. These exchanges kept her grounded in her origins and reminded her why she worked so hard to build reserves. Relations with pirate associates varied by personality and reliability. She maintained close but formal ties with the Six Flag leaders, meeting them regularly and remembering details about their families and past raids. One captain from the Black Flag fleet, known for his quick temper, received extra patience from her. She suggested adjustments to his tribute zone that reduced friction with neighbouring groups. Another leader, older and more cautious, appreciated her habit of sending small gifts of medicine when his crew suffered from fever. These gestures cost little but built quiet loyalty. She avoided favoritism, treating every captain according to his performance and the needs of the fleet. Weird habits of her own emerged in the daily management of the flagship. She insisted on inspecting the water barrels herself every few days, tasting samples to check for spoilage. She kept a small set of polished stones in a pouch, using them to track ship counts and tribute totals when paper was damp or in short supply. Each stone represented a fixed number of junks or taels of silver, and she rearranged them on the cabin table during planning sessions. Crew members learned to leave the stones untouched. They had become part of her private system for staying organised under pressure. Ambitions extended beyond the present. She pictured a future where the Confederation could negotiate a lasting arrangement with the Qing court, perhaps official recognition in exchange for controlling smaller pirate groups and protecting trade routes. This idea stayed private for now, shared only with Zheng Yi during late-night talks. She imagined using the accumulated silver to buy land or businesses on shore if the time ever came to step back from the sea. These long-term plans gave her direction and helped her endure the uncertainties of fleet life. The people around her shaped these ambitions in subtle ways. Common sailors told stories during meals about their villages and the hardships they had left behind. Hearing them reinforced her determination to keep the central fund strong, so that widows and orphans received support. Rival captains from outside the Confederation occasionally sent messengers seeking alliances. She evaluated each offer carefully, accepting only those that strengthened their position without creating new weaknesses. Coastal villagers who brought tribute sometimes lingered to speak with her about their needs, and she used those conversations to adjust policies that kept the system running smoothly. Her relationship with Zheng Yi continued to evolve through these years. They had no biological children together, a fact neither mentioned openly. Instead, they poured their energy into Chungpo Tsai and the fleet itself. Zheng Yi grew more reliant on her judgment as the Confederation expanded, consulting her before every major decision. She in turn supported his outward authority without question in front of the captains. This balance allowed them both to focus on what they did best. He on the visible command, she on the invisible structure that held everything together. Fears occasionally surfaced in small ways. During typhoon season, she checked the rigging and anchors more often than necessary, her hands moving quickly over ropes and chains. She watched the horizon for signs of approaching imperial squadrons, even when scouts reported clear waters. These moments passed quickly, replaced by steady work. The fears never paralysed her, they simply added urgency to her record-keeping and her careful cultivation of allies. Daily life reflected these personal ties. Mornings began with a quiet review of the stones and ledgers. Afternoons might include training sessions with Chungpo Tsai, teaching him to calculate shares or read wind patterns. Evenings brought meetings with captains or quiet talks with Zheng Yi. She ate the same meals as the crew, but always saved a small portion to share with the boy or to send back to her family. These routines created a sense of normalcy in a world built on risk. The ambitions she held stayed practical. She wanted the Confederation to endure, wanted Chungpo Tsai to grow into a capable leader, wanted her birth family to live without the constant worry she had known as a child. She wanted personal security that no storm or official decree could erase. Every decision, every tribute adjustment, every share division, every message sent moved her closer to those goals. The inner life she kept mostly to herself guided the outward actions that everyone else saw. Key dynamics with pirate associates deepened over time. She noticed which captains kept their word and which ones needed reminders. She rewarded reliability with better zones or extra supplies and addressed problems directly but calmly. This approach prevented the rivalries that had destroyed earlier pirate groups. Chungpo Tsai watched these interactions and began to copy her methods, strengthening the next generation of leadership. Her habits of saving and planning became more pronounced as the fleet grew. She suggested small improvements to the central fund, adding a portion of foreign silver coins, setting aside extra cloth for sales, maintaining a list of trusted shore contacts. These measures added layers of protection against hard times. Zheng Yi approved each suggestion, recognizing how they strengthened the whole operation. The personal ties she built with Zheng Yi, with Cheng Tsai, with her distant family, and with the captains formed a network that supported her ambitions and quieted her fears. The Confederation had become more than a business of the sea. It had become the structure through which she could shape a future on her own terms. Every day at sea added another small piece to that structure, moving her steadily toward the security she had worked for since leaving the flower boats. Who spans death in 1807? The Confederation reached its greatest extent in the first months of 1807. Operations had pushed southward along the coast, reaching into waters near Vietnam, where new tribute opportunities appeared among the trading routes linked to the Nguyen lords. Zheng Yi wanted to secure these southern passages before the summer typhoon season arrived. The flagship and a squadron of 200 junks moved steadily down the coast, collecting regular payments from fishing fleets and small ports, while scouts watched for merchant ships heading toward Macau and Guangzhou. Life continued its familiar patterns during these months. She still reviewed the stone counters each morning, noted tribute receipts, and spent time teaching Cheng Tsai how to manage disputes between captains. Zheng Yi seemed in good health, his voice steady when he gave orders, his step sure on the rolling deck. The two of them continued their evening discussions about fleet strength and possible future arrangements with the Qing court. Nothing in those weeks suggested that change was coming so suddenly. In mid-November, the squadron lay off the Vietnamese coast when the weather turned without warning. The sky darkened in the space of an hour, winds rose sharply, and the sea grew heavy. The junks shortened sail and prepared for a gale. Zheng Yi remained on deck directing the crew as they secured lines and lashed down loose equipment. She stayed below in the cabin securing the ledgers and the bamboo tube of savings. The ship pitched violently. At some point during the worst of the storm, Zheng Yi lost his footing near the rail. Witnesses said the wind caught him as he tried to reach a line. He fell into the churning water before anyone could throw a rope. Search boats launched immediately, but the conditions made recovery impossible. By nightfall, the fleet accepted that Zheng Yi was gone. He was 42 years old. The news spread through the squadron by signal flags and messenger boats. On every junk, men gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices about what would happen next. The Confederation had never faced the loss of its central leader. Some captains had joined only because of personal loyalty to Zheng Yi. Others worried that rival flag leaders would now try to claim the red flag fleet for themselves. The immediate feeling was one of uncertainty more than grief. The men knew the sea took people. What they did not know was whether the alliance could hold without the man who had built it. In the command cabin she sat alone for the first hours after the confirmation. She did not weep openly. The habits of years at sea had taught her to keep strong emotions private. Instead, she felt a heavy stillness. The partnership that had given structure to her life for 6 years was suddenly ended. She thought of the silver reserve, the stone counters, the records she had kept so carefully. All of it now rested on her shoulders alone. Her main concern was not personal loss, but the survival of the fleet and the security she had worked to build. She knew that hesitation could cause the Confederation to fracture within days. The next morning she called a meeting of the senior captains on the flagship. Cheng Tsai stood at her side. She spoke clearly and without long speeches. She reminded them of the rules they had all agreed to under Zheng Yi, and stated that those agreements remained in force. The central fund would continue, tribute zones would stay as assigned, and shares would be divided according to the established system. She did not claim the title of commander outright on that first day. Instead, she proposed that the flag leaders meet again in 1 week, to discuss the future leadership of the Red Flag Fleet. This measured approach prevented immediate chaos. Several captains who had been close to Zheng Yi expressed support for keeping the existing structure. Others waited to see which way the stronger leaders would move. She used the week to speak privately with key men, reminding them of past favours and the benefits of unity. She pointed out that divided fleets had always been easier for the Qing navy to defeat. She also made sure that Cheng Po Tsai was visible and active, carrying messages and helping organise the daily operations. His adoption gave her a natural connection to the next generation of leadership. The emotional impact on the crew varied. Older sailors who had sailed with Zheng Yi from the beginning felt the loss most sharply. They spoke of his fairness and his ability to keep order among strong personalities. Younger men worried more about their shares and the continuation of regular tribute. She made a point of walking the decks of the flagship each day, stopping to speak with small groups. She assured them that provisions would continue and that no changes would be made to the division of spoils without agreement. These small conversations helped steady the men. Political forces outside the fleet also played a role in those tense weeks. Qing officials in Guangzhou received word of Zheng Yi's death through their own networks. Some governors saw an opportunity to launch attacks while the pirates were disorganized. Patrols increased slightly along the northern edges of Confederation waters. At the same time, the Nguyen authorities in Vietnam watched the situation closely, unsure whether the southern squadrons would remain stable. These external pressures added urgency to the need for quick unity inside the fleet. Her private habits continued even during this uncertain time. She still counted her stones each morning, though the numbers now carried heavier meaning. She added extra entries to the ledgers, noting which captains had offered support and which ones remained silent. The bamboo tube of savings stayed sealed. She checked it once when alone. These small routines gave her a sense of control when everything else felt precarious. Cheng Po Tsai proved valuable in the days after the death. He carried out her instructions without question, and spoke with younger officers in a way that calmed their concerns. She began to rely on him more openly, treating him as both adopted son and trusted lieutenant. Some captains noted this arrangement with approval, seeing it as a way to keep leadership within the family line without breaking tradition. By the end of the week, when the flag leaders gathered again, the atmosphere had shifted from open uncertainty to cautious discussion. She presented a proposal. The Red Flag Fleet would continue under her direction with Cheng Po Tsai as her chief lieutenant. The other flag leaders would keep their districts and autonomy as before. In return, they would recognize her authority over major decisions affecting the entire confederation. Several captains who owed their positions to Zheng Yi spoke in favor. Others, seeing that no single rival had enough support to challenge her directly, agreed to the arrangement for the sake of stability. The immediate crisis passed, but the organizational turmoil left lasting marks. Some captains who had hoped to break away and form their own groups chose instead to stay, at least for the present. A few smaller squadrons quietly drifted toward the edges of the Confederation, testing how far they could operate independently. She noted these movements carefully and adjusted tribute zones where necessary to keep the main force intact. The death of Zheng Yi tested every part of the structure they had built together. For her, it marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another. The ambitions she had carried quietly, security, stability, a lasting place for herself and those close to her, now had to be defended without the protection of her husband's name. The weeks following November 1807 showed her true capabilities more clearly than any previous year. She had moved from partner to sole leader in a world that expected women to step aside. The Confederation held, but it would never again be exactly as it had been before the gale off the Vietnamese coast. Claiming the command. The week following Zheng Yi's death passed in a tense but orderly fashion across the Confederation. Junks kept their stations, tribute boats continued their runs to shore, and scouts maintained their patrols. No open rebellion erupted, yet the captains watched each other closely. Some had already begun private conversations about what might happen if the Red Flag Fleet splintered. Others waited to see whether the widow of their former leader could hold the centre together. She understood that the appearance of steady command mattered as much as the reality in those early days. She moved deliberately. Each morning she appeared on the quarterdeck of the flagship at the usual time, dressed in her practical sea tunic and trousers, hat tied firmly against the wind. She reviewed scout reports with the same calm attention she had always shown, noting changes in Qing patrol patterns or merchant movements. Crew members saw her there and carried on with their tasks, swabbing decks, checking rigging, cooking the morning congee without the hesitation that might have signalled deeper unrest. By keeping to routine, she signalled that the structure remained intact, even without Zheng Yi. Chung Po-tsai became her most visible support. At 23, he had grown into a capable officer, tall and steady, with the same practical manner she had encouraged. She assigned him to lead small detachments on routine collection runs and to carry messages between flag leaders. His presence on deck, relaying her orders without hesitation, helped steady the younger sailors who might otherwise have wondered about the chain of command. She made sure he ate with the senior officers and spoke in meetings when appropriate, gradually establishing him as part of the leadership circle. Private conversations with the flag leaders took place one by one. She invited each to the flagship under the pretext of routine business discussing tribute totals or zone boundaries. In the quiet of the cabin, she spoke plainly. She reminded them of the agreements signed under Zheng Yi and the costs of division. Weaker squadrons would fall first to Qing patrols or rival gangs. She pointed to the central fund that had kept their crews fed and repaired during lean months. She offered no threats, only facts. To those who showed reluctance, she suggested small adjustments, better tribute zones, or priority access to captured goods that addressed their immediate concerns without weakening the whole. The Black Flag leader, a man named Guo Podai, who commanded a strong squadron in the eastern waters, proved the most difficult. He had ambitions of his own and had already spoken with captains from the yellow and green flags about possible realignments. She met him last, knowing his influence could sway others. In the meeting, she acknowledged his strength openly. His ships were well armed, his men disciplined, his tribute collection reliable. Then she laid out the alternative. If the Confederation held together under her direction, he would keep his current district plus a larger share of any joint operations against foreign traders. If it broke apart, Qing officials would move against the smaller groups first. Guo listened without interrupting. At the end, he agreed to recognize her leadership for the present, though he made it clear he would watch closely. The second meeting of the flag leaders, held 10 days after Zheng Yi's death, confirmed the arrangement. 6 captains gathered on the flagship's main deck under a stretched canvas awning to block the midday sun. She sat at the head of the low table with Chung Po-tsai beside her. Charts and ledgers lay spread before them. She opened by stating the facts. The Confederation had grown under Zheng Yi's rules and could continue under the same system. She proposed that she assume command of the Red Flag Fleet directly, with Chung Po-tsai as her adopted son and chief deputy. The other flags would retain their autonomy and their leaders. All major decisions affecting the entire force, large raids, negotiations with outsiders, changes to tribute rates, would require her approval. Discussion followed in measured tones. The White Flag leader, older and cautious, spoke first in support. He had sailed with Zheng Yi longest and valued stability above personal gain. The Blue Flag captain agreed, noting that divided fleets had always lost to imperial forces in the past. The Yellow Flag leader raised concerns about tribute shares but accepted her offer of a slight increase in his zone. Guo Podai spoke last. He stated his support but added that he expected the same fairness Zheng Yi had shown. She nodded once and confirmed that the rules would not change. No vote was taken. None was needed. The captains rose, bowed slightly in the direction of the command cabin, and returned to their ships. By evening, signal flags carried the news across the anchored squadron. The Confederation would continue under the same structure, now led by Zheng Yi Sao. The title spread quickly first among the Red Flag crews, then outward to the other districts. Within days, every junk flew the red flag with the understanding that orders came from the flagship. Consolidation required constant attention in the following months. She sent Chung Po-tsai to visit each flag leader in turn, carrying written confirmations of new zone boundaries and share agreements. These visits served a dual purpose. They reinforced her authority and allowed him to assess morale firsthand. He reported back on which captains seemed steady and which ones needed closer watching. She adjusted assignments accordingly, pairing doubtful squadrons with loyal ones for joint operations, sending reliable men to fill key positions. Daily routines on the flagship adjusted to her new role. She now issued orders directly when necessary, though she still preferred to work through senior officers. Mornings brought the same review of reports, but now with a sharper focus on internal cohesion. She kept the stone counters on the cabin table, rearranging them to track not only ships and tribute, but also the loyalty of each flag. She added a new habit, writing brief notes after every meeting with a captain, recording what was said and any promises made. These notes went into a separate sealed tube, separate from the main ledgers. The crew's response varied by age and background. Older sailors who remembered Zheng Yi accepted her leadership as a natural continuation. They saw her as the partner who had always handled the details Zheng Yi left to her. Younger men, especially those who had joined recently, needed more reassurance. She made a point of walking the decks regularly, stopping to speak with small groups about provisions or upcoming operations. She listened to their concerns, shortages of rice, worries about Qing patrols, and addressed what she could immediately. These small interactions built quiet confidence. External pressures helped solidify her position. Qing officials in Guangzhou, hearing of Zheng Yi's death, launched a modest campaign of patrols and proclamations offering rewards for pirate defections. Several small independent groups took the bait and surrendered, but none from the main confederation followed. The failed effort showed the Qing that the fleet remained intact and discouraged further immediate action. At the same time, foreign merchants at Canton continued to pay protection money, preferring a known arrangement to the uncertainty of new leaders. These steady payments reinforced her authority. Captains saw that tribute flowed as before. Chongpo Tsai grew into his role quickly. He led his first independent squadron on a tribute run along the Fujian coast and returned with full collections and no incidents. She praised him publicly at the next officers' meal, a simple statement that carried weight. He began to handle more of the daily coordination, freeing her to focus on longer-term planning. Their relationship remained close but professional. She treated him as both son and lieutenant, never allowing sentiment to cloud judgment. The emotional weight of the transition stayed with her privately. Nights in the cabin sometimes brought memories of shared evenings with Zheng Yi, quiet talks over charts, the soft glow of the lantern. She felt the absence most in those hours, yet she channeled it into work. The reserve of silver grew steadily. She added portions from every major capture. The bamboo tube now held enough to support a small household on shore, if the need ever arose. This private security gave her the calm needed to lead in public. By the spring of 1808, the Confederation had stabilized under her command. The 6 flags operated in coordination, tribute arrived on schedule, and raids continued against merchant ships that ignored warnings. No captain had openly challenged her. The structure Zheng Yi had built held because she had defended it with the same steady methods she had always used: careful observation, practical adjustments, and quiet persistence. The title of commander now rested on her alone, earned not by force but by the simple fact that the fleet still functioned as one body. She understood that holding command required constant effort. Captains would test boundaries if they sensed weakness. Qing officials would watch for any sign of fracture. She prepared for both by strengthening the central fund, training Chongpo Tsai, and keeping records that could prove useful in any future negotiation. The widow who had once lived on a flower boat now led the largest pirate force in Chinese waters, and she intended to keep it that way for as long as the sea allowed. The pirate regulations. With the Confederation stabilized under her command by the spring of 1808, she turned her attention to a problem that had grown more pressing since Zheng Yi's death. The fleet now numbered well over 1,000 junks and several thousand men spread across 6 districts. The old informal understandings that had worked under her husband no longer held the same force. Captains sometimes kept extra shares of captured goods for their own crews. Smaller groups carried out private raids that interfered with regular tribute collection. A few incidents of mistreatment toward captured villagers had already reached her through reports, risking the goodwill that kept coastal communities paying without resistance. She saw clearly that without written and enforced rules, the entire structure could erode from within, faster than any Qing patrol could damage it from outside. She spent several weeks in the command cabin reviewing the ledgers and the stone counters that tracked every major capture since the Confederation began. The records showed patterns of uneven division and occasional losses that had gone unpunished. Her main concern remained the same as always: long-term security for the fleet and for herself. A disciplined force could negotiate from strength if the time came to deal with the Qing court. A loose collection of ships would collapse under pressure and leave everyone exposed. This practical calculation guided every decision she made about the new regulations. The code took shape in a series of clear articles that she wrote out herself on sheets of paper using the simple characters she had learned over the cruise, years from literate officers. The first article addressed plunder. Every item taken in a raid or received as tribute had to be presented immediately to the squadron leader and then brought to the central fund on the flagship or the nearest flag vessel. 20% went to the men who had carried out the action. The remaining 80% entered the common store for repairs, medicine, provisions, and support for widows and injured sailors. No private hoarding was allowed. She made the percentages exact so there could be no argument later. This rule replaced the earlier loose arrangements that had let some captains take more than their share. The second article dealt with theft from the fund itself. Any man found taking even a small amount of silver, rice, or cloth without authorization faced public flogging for the first offence and execution by beheading for the second. She chose these punishments because they were visible and immediate. Crews watched the process on deck, and the memory served as a stronger deterrent than any private warning. The rule applied equally to ordinary sailors and to captains, a point she emphasized when the articles were read aloud at the next gathering of the flag leaders. Treatment of prisoners received its own strict guidelines. Rape or any forced violation of women captured during raids brought immediate execution. The offender was bound and thrown overboard in front of the crew of his own junk. This rule came directly from her knowledge of the harm such acts caused to village relations. Coastal communities had begun to fear the fleet less when they saw that women and children were left unharmed. The regulation protected the steady flow of tribute that formed the backbone of their income. Captured women who were not immediately released received another provision. If a man wished to marry one of them, he could do so only with her clear agreement and with approval from his captain. The marriage had to be recorded in the squadron ledger. No force was permitted. Women who chose not to marry were to be set ashore at the nearest friendly village with a small amount of cloth or silver as compensation. This approach turned potential enemies into possible allies and reduced the number of desperate escapes or revenge attacks that had plagued less disciplined pirate groups in the past. Desertion and unauthorized absence formed the next part of the code. Any man who left his junk without permission for more than 3 days faced death upon return. Those who tried to slip away with stolen goods received the same penalty. The rule applied during both active operations and quiet periods in sheltered bays. She understood that in a fleet this large, even small losses of manpower could weaken entire squadrons. The regulation also covered gambling debts that led to fights. Such disputes had to be brought before officers for settlement rather than settled with knives on deck. The final articles covered internal order and command. No captain could launch a raid outside his assigned district without her approval through the flagship. All signals between ships remained standardized, and any change in flags or horn calls required notification. Officers had to report monthly on crew numbers, provisions, and any disciplinary cases. She added a requirement that every junk keep a simple log of daily activities written by the most literate man aboard. These logs could be inspected at any time, creating a chain of written accountability that had never existed before. She announced the full code at a gathering of all 6 flag leaders aboard the flagship in late spring 1808. The meeting took place on the main deck under the same canvas awning used for earlier discussions. Each captain received a handwritten copy on heavy paper sealed with the red fleet mark. She read the articles aloud slowly so the officers could copy the words accurately for their own crews. No debate followed. The captains returned to their squadrons and had the rules explained to every man during the next morning assembly. Within a week, the entire Confederation knew the new laws. Enforcement began immediately. She assigned Chung Po-tsai to oversee the first inspections of plunder from recent raids. He checked the division of goods on several junks and reported back the same evening. Where discrepancies appeared, the excess was transferred to the central fund, and the responsible captain received a formal warning. 2 men caught stealing small amounts of silver during a tribute collection faced public flogging on their own decks the following day. The crews watched in silence. The message spread quickly that the rules carried real weight. Daily life across the junks changed in noticeable ways after the regulations took hold. Morning assemblies now included a reading of 1 article from the code, rotating through the list so every man heard the full set every few weeks. Plunder handling became more orderly. Captured chests and sacks were stacked on deck under guard until they could be weighed and divided according to the percentages. Men received their shares in small cloth bags marked with their junk's number. The central fund grew steadily, allowing for better stores of dried fish, salt, and herbal medicines. Villages noticed the difference. Tribute deliveries arrived with fewer complaints and more reliable protection. The captains adjusted their habits as well. They kept the required logs and sent monthly summaries by fast sampan to the flagship. Some older leaders grumbled privately about the extra paperwork, but they complied because the system reduced arguments over shares and kept their own crews better fed. Younger captains who had risen under her leadership welcomed the clarity. It gave them clear guidelines to follow when dealing with new recruits. Chung Po-tsai used the code as a teaching tool during training sessions, explaining each rule and the reason behind it. Her own routines incorporated the new regulations without fanfare. She reviewed the incoming logs every few days, noting patterns in enforcement. When a case of desertion occurred in the Green Flag district, she ordered the man brought to the flagship for judgment rather than leaving it to the local captain. The execution took place at dawn with representatives from other squadrons watching. She stood on the quarterdeck during the process, her face calm, her hands steady on the rail. The event served as a reminder across the entire fleet. Political forces outside the Confederation reacted in subtle ways. Qing officials in Guangzhou received reports of the new discipline through their spies and informants. Some governors noted in private correspondence that the pirates now operated with more order than certain imperial garrisons. This perception made large-scale naval campaigns harder to justify. The court preferred to portray the fleet as chaotic bandits rather than a structured organization. At the same time, foreign merchants at Canton found the protection fees more predictable. Fewer ships disappeared without trace, and the tribute system ran on schedule. The regulations helped maintain the balance that kept both sides from escalating. The code also affected the smaller human details of shipboard life. Gambling continued but stayed within limits because disputes went to officers instead of turning violent. Meals remained the same rice and fish, yet portions felt more secure because the central fund supplied extras during lean weeks. Women who sailed with the fleet or lived in protected villages spoke of feeling safer when pirate junks visited. The rules had created a measure of predictability in a world that had always run on chance and force. She kept her personal reserve of silver untouched during this period, adding to it only from her command share after every major division. The bamboo tube stayed sealed in its compartment. Her fear of internal collapse had eased slightly now that the articles were in place, but she never stopped watching the ledgers. Ambitions for the fleet remained practical, a force strong enough to endure, and perhaps one day negotiate terms with the Empire. The regulations formed the foundation for that possibility. Captains and crews adapted at different speeds. Some men who had joined for the promise of easy loot found the new order restrictive and quietly left during shore visits. Others stayed because steady shares and medical care outweighed the old freedoms. The fleet as a whole grew more cohesive. Tribute collections increased because villages trusted the protection more. Raids became more efficient since crews knew exactly what to expect from each action. By the end of 1808, the regulations had become part of the daily rhythm on every junk. The code was read at assemblies, plunder was divided by fixed percentages, punishments followed clear steps, and logs tracked every movement. She had taken the loose alliance her husband left behind and turned it into a structured organisation capable of operating across hundreds of miles of coastline. The widow from the flower boats had given the Confederation a framework that would outlast any single leader. The red flags still flew, but now they represented more than strength at sea. They stood for a system that held thousands of men to a common set of expectations. Naval clashes. With Qing, the Qing Navy's attempts to challenge the Confederation grew more frequent after the regulations took hold in 1808. Officials in Guangzhou and other southern ports could no longer ignore the scale of the Red Flag fleet. Reports from merchants, village headmen, and coastal garrisons painted a picture of organised piracy that collected more revenue than some provincial treasuries. The Jia Qing Emperor issued edicts demanding action, and local governors received funds to repair war junks and recruit additional sailors. These efforts produced a series of engagements that tested the Confederation's discipline and the effectiveness of the new code. Most clashes followed a similar pattern. Qing patrols, usually squadrons of 10 to 20 war junks, armed with bow-mounted cannon and manned by conscripted sailors, ventured into Confederation waters, hoping to catch smaller detachments off guard. The imperial ships flew yellow banners with dragon emblems and carried imperial seals on their sterns. Their crews included a mix of regular bannermen, local recruits from fishing villages, and sometimes Manchu officers sent south as punishment postings. Pay arrived irregularly, provisions often ran short, and morale suffered from the long patrols far from home ports. The Confederation's response relied on speed and numbers rather than direct confrontation. Scouts spotted approaching patrols days in advance, using high lookout points on islands or the mastheads of fast junks. Signal flags passed the warning along the chain of command. When a Qing squadron entered a tribute zone, the nearest flag leader gathered his available ships, typically 30 to 50 junks, and moved to intercept. The pirate vessels approached in loose formation, spreading out to avoid presenting a single target to the imperial cannon. Engagements usually began at mid-range with exchange of fire. Qing junks carried heavier guns but loaded them slowly and aimed poorly in rolling seas. Confederation ships responded with lighter, quicker-firing cannon and swarms of matchlock fire from the decks. The goal was never to sink the imperial vessels outright. That would force the court to commit larger forces. Instead, the pirates targeted rigging, masts, and sails to disable movement. Once the Qing squadron lost steerage or speed, boarding parties launched from multiple directions. Grappling hooks flew, planks bridged the gaps, and men swarmed across with short swords and spears. Fighters on both sides experienced these clashes as chaotic and exhausting. Qing sailors, many pressed into service, fought with reluctance. They had little training in boarding actions and often broke formation when the enemy closed. Confederation men, hardened by years at sea and motivated by shares of captured goods, moved with practiced coordination. The strict rules helped. No unnecessary killing of surrendering men, no looting of personal effects until the plunder was secured. Wounded Qing sailors received basic care bandages, herbal poultices before being set adrift in small boats or released at the nearest shore. This practice discouraged prolonged resistance and reduced the number of imperial martyrs the court could use in propaganda. One of the larger encounters took place in the summer of 1809 off the coast near the Leizhou Peninsula. A Qing squadron of 18 war junks, reinforced with 2 fireships loaded with combustibles, sailed into Black Flag waters under Guo Podai's command. Scouts reported the approach early. Guo gathered 40 junks and positioned them in a wide arc across the patrol's path. When the imperial ships appeared on the horizon, the pirates closed quickly. Cannon exchanges lasted less than an hour before the Qing formation began to break. Several imperial junks lost masts. Others turned to flee but found escape routes blocked. Boarding followed in waves. By dusk, the Confederation had captured 6 vessels intact, burned 3, and forced the rest to withdraw under cover of night. The captured junks were stripped of usable cannon and timber, then released empty. The Qing commander escaped but lost face in his report to Guangzhou. The fighters who lived through these actions carried the experience in different ways. Confederation men returned to their junks, with minor wounds bandaged and stories to tell during evening meals. They spoke of the moment the imperial line wavered, the sound of splintering wood, the sight of yellow banners trailing in the water. Injuries, cuts from blades, burns from matchlock powder were treated with the fleet's herbal stores. The Central Fund paid for extra rice and medicine during recovery. Men who performed well in boarding received bonus shares, a practice that reinforced the regulations. On the Qing side, the aftermath looked different. Surviving officers wrote careful reports that downplayed losses and exaggerated pirate casualties. Sailors who returned to port carried tales of disciplined red flag crews and swift boarding that made future patrols reluctant. Desertion rates rose in the Southern Navy. Some men slipped away during shore stops rather than face another encounter. The court responded by increasing rewards for captured pirate leaders, but the offers rarely tempted Confederation men who knew the value of steady tribute and shared plunder. Coastal populations felt the clashes through indirect effects. Villages near battle sites sometimes saw drifting wreckage or small boats carrying released prisoners. Headmen collected what they could timber for repairs, rope, iron fittings, and sent reports to the nearest flag leader. In return, they received extra protection patrols for a time. Some settlements quietly cheered the Confederation's victories. Imperial patrols had a reputation for demanding food and labour without payment. The red flag junks, by contrast, followed the tribute agreements strictly after the new code. She oversaw the broader response from the flagship. After each major clash, Chengpo Tsai brought detailed accounts from the participating captains. She reviewed the logs, noted which junks had performed well, and adjusted assignments for the next patrol season. She kept the Central Fund ready to replace lost cannon or repair damaged hulls. When a captain reported excessive casualties, she sent extra medical supplies and reassigned the squadron to quieter tribute zones until it recovered. These measures maintained morale across the fleet. The clashes also influenced internal dynamics. Captains who led successful actions gained prestige and larger shares of joint operations. Guo Podai's victory off Leizhao strengthened his position within the Confederation, though he remained careful to report every detail to the flagship. Men who had once considered breaking away now saw the advantages of staying under unified command. The regulations proved their worth in battle. Clear chains of command and disciplined boarding prevented the confusion that had doomed other pirate groups. Broader social impacts appeared along the coast. Trade routes shifted slightly as merchants avoided waters where recent fights had occurred. Some larger merchants increased their tribute payments to ensure faster warnings of Qing movements. Fishing fleets sailed closer to Confederation-protected bays during patrol seasons. The Qing Navy's inability to break the red flag hold led to quiet resentment among local officials. Governors wrote to Beijing asking for more ships and funds, but the court, still recovering from earlier rebellions, offered only promises and small reinforcements. By 1810, the pattern had become familiar. Qing patrols probed, Confederation squadrons responded, engagements ended with pirate victories or stalemates, and the fleet remained intact. Casualties stayed manageable because neither side sought total destruction. The Confederation lost junks and men but replaced them quickly through captured vessels and new recruits drawn by steady shares. The Qing Navy lost prestige and manpower but avoided the kind of decisive defeat that would force a major campaign. She watched these developments with steady attention. Each clash confirmed the value of the regulations and the importance of unity. She added notes to her private records about which captains showed reliability under fire and which needed closer supervision. The stone counters on her cabin table now included markers for battle outcomes alongside tribute totals. Her ambitions remained unchanged. A fleet strong enough to endure pressure from the Empire, and perhaps one day reach terms that would allow a peaceful transition to shore life. The naval clashes marked a new phase in the Confederation's existence. What had begun as tribute collection and occasional raids now included regular defense of coastal waters. Fighters on both sides adapted to the reality. Qing sailors learned caution. Confederation men learned discipline. Coastal villages learned to navigate the space between the two forces. Through it all, the red flags continued to fly, held in place by rules, shared interests, and the quiet leadership that kept the whole system functioning even under fire. Foreign power, encounters. The expanding presence of European and American trading ships in the Pearl River Delta and along the southern coast brought new layers of complexity to the Confederation's operations by the later years of the 1800s decade. British East India Company vessels, Portuguese frigates from Macau, American merchantmen from Salem and Boston, and occasional Dutch or French traders all followed the same seasonal rhythm, arriving in late autumn with silver, woolens, clocks, and increasing quantities of opium from India, then departing in spring loaded with tea, silk, and porcelain. These ships carried far more valuable cargoes than most Chinese junks, and their captains and supercargoes were accustomed to dealing with local intermediaries in the Canton factories. They were also better armed than typical merchant vessels, often mounting a dozen or more cannon and carrying small detachments of armed sailors. The Confederation first encountered these foreign ships systematically in 1808 and 1809, when tribute zones extended farther offshore to cover the main anchorage at Whampoa and the approaches from the open sea. Scouts began tracking the arrival dates of foreign fleets, noting which ships flew British or American colours and which carried the most promising cargoes. The goal was never outright seizure of the large Indiamen or country ships. That would have provoked naval retaliation from the foreign power's own warships stationed at Macau or in the Indian Ocean. Instead, the Confederation developed a system of protection payments, similar to the one used with Chinese merchants. Fast junks approached foreign vessels at a respectful distance, displayed the red flag, and sent a small boat carrying a spokesman who spoke pidgin English or relied on an interpreter. The spokesman presented a simple demand: a fixed fee, usually several hundred Spanish dollars, or an equivalent in silver for safe passage through Confederation waters. In return, the ship received a red pennant to fly from the masthead, signalling to other pirate junks that it had paid and should be left alone. Most captains complied after brief negotiation. The amount was calibrated to what the supercargo could afford without seriously damaging the voyage's profit margin. Refusal led to shadowing by several junks until the ship reached Whampoa or turned back, a tactic that often persuaded the captain to pay rather than risk delay or damage. Actual attacks on foreign ships remained rare. When they occurred, they targeted smaller vessels that had ignored warnings or strayed far from the main routes. Interactions with Portuguese authorities in Macau added another dimension. Macau had long served as a base for Portuguese shipping in the region, and its governor maintained a small naval presence, several frigates and armed brigs to protect trade and the enclave itself. The Confederation avoided direct raids on Macau harbour, but occasionally intercepted Portuguese country ships trading between Macau and other Chinese ports. In one notable case in 1809, a Portuguese brig carrying opium and silver was boarded off the coast near Lantau Island after refusing the protection fee. The cargo was taken, the crew released unharmed on a small boat with enough water and provisions to reach shore. The incident drew a formal protest from the Portuguese governor to Qing officials in Guangzhou, who responded with the usual vague promises of action. Behind the scenes, the Confederation sent a message through intermediaries, offering to respect Portuguese vessels that paid the fee. After several months of quiet negotiation, the arrangement settled into place. Most Portuguese ships carried the red pennant and passed without interference. British encounters proved more complicated. The East India Company maintained its own armed vessels and enjoyed close relations with Qing authorities through the Canton system. When Confederation junks approached British Indiamen, the response varied. Some captains paid quickly to avoid trouble, others refused and relied on their cannon and the presence of Royal Navy escorts farther offshore. In 1810, a squadron of red flag junks shadowed a large British ship that had declined the fee. The vessel anchored under the guns of a Royal Navy frigate that happened to be in the area. No shots were exchanged, but the incident was reported back to London and added to growing British complaints about coastal insecurity. The Confederation adjusted tactics after this event, focusing on ships that sailed without escort and avoiding any direct challenge to foreign warships. American merchants, newer to the China trade and often operating on tighter margins, proved more willing to pay. Their ships carried ginseng, furs and silver, and captains preferred a small fee to the risk of losing an entire cargo. Several American captains developed regular contacts with Confederation intermediaries, arranging payments through brokers in the floating city near Whampoa. These arrangements ran smoothly because the Americans asked few questions and kept records discreetly. The Confederation gained a steady source of silver dollars, which circulated widely among the crews and strengthened the central fund. Foreign crews experienced these encounters in varied ways. Sailors on paid ships saw the red flag junks as a kind of local tax collector, annoying but preferable to outright attack. Those on ships that resisted spoke of disciplined formations and quick approaches that made resistance seem futile. Stories spread in forecastles from Canton to Calcutta and Boston, tales of pirate fleets numbering hundreds of sails, of women commanding from flagships, of rules that spared lives when surrender came promptly. These accounts mixed fact with exaggeration, but helped shape the foreign perception of the Confederation as a serious force rather than scattered bandits. On the Confederation side, the foreign ships brought new opportunities, risks. Captured cargoes sometimes included unfamiliar items, watches, telescopes, woolen cloth, opium chests that required careful handling. She established a system for sorting these goods. Opium went to trusted brokers who distributed it inland. Metals and tools entered the central stores. Textiles were divided among crews or sold in coastal markets. The silver dollars were especially valued. They weighed reliably and carried consistent value across regions. She kept a separate ledger for foreign captures, tracking what came in and how it was used to buy provisions or repair junks. Chung Po Tsai took an active role in several foreign encounters. He led the approach boat on multiple occasions, learning the pidgin phrases needed to negotiate fees. His calm manner and clear instructions helped prevent misunderstandings that might have escalated into violence. She used these experiences to train him further, emphasizing the importance of maintaining distance from foreign warships and never pressing a demand when a Navy vessel was in sight. The broader political context shaped these interactions. Qing officials tolerated the Confederation's activities against foreign traders to a degree because they disrupted the Canton system without directly challenging imperial authority. At the same time, the court received complaints from European envoys about losses and demanded action. Governors responded with proclamations and small patrols but avoided large commitments. The Confederation benefited from this ambiguity. Foreign powers pressed the Qing for protection, the Qing deflected responsibility, and the Red Flag Fleet continued to collect fees. She monitored these developments closely from the flagship. Each foreign payment added to the central fund and demonstrated the Confederation's reach beyond Chinese shipping. She adjusted tribute zones to include more offshore waters while keeping strict rules about avoiding direct clashes with foreign navies. The regulations proved useful here too. Boarding parties followed the same discipline, prisoners were treated according to the code, and plunder was divided without argument. By 1810, the Confederation had established a working relationship with most foreign traders operating in southern waters. Payments arrived regularly, red pennants flew on paid ships, and major incidents stayed rare. The encounters added a new source of revenue and brought the fleet into contact with the wider world beyond the China coast. Silver dollars flowed into the junks, opium moved through discreet channels, and foreign goods appeared in coastal markets. Through it all, she maintained the same steady oversight, reviewing logs, adjusting assignments, keeping records that had held the Confederation together since Zheng Yi's death. The red flags now represented not only coastal power, but a force capable of negotiating with the representatives of distant empires. Road to amnesty. The steady flow of silver from foreign ships and the continued success against Qing patrols created an illusion of strength that lasted through the early months of 1810. Yet beneath the surface, the Confederation faced mounting strains that she tracked carefully in her ledgers. The Jiaqing Emperor had grown impatient with the reports coming from Guangdong. New funds reached southern governors for ship repairs and recruitment. Larger imperial squadrons began operating farther from port, sometimes coordinating with local militias on shore. At the same time, the opium trade that had provided quiet income started drawing complaints from Beijing, where officials viewed the drug as a threat to imperial order. The Confederation's protection fees on foreign vessels now risked turning into a larger diplomatic issue between the Qing court and the European powers. She spent long evenings in the cabin reviewing the stone counters and the monthly logs from every flag. The numbers showed the fleet still held over 1,000 junks and more than 70,000 men, but the cost of maintaining them had risen. Repairs after clashes consumed more timber and canvas. New recruits expected steady shares, and the central fund, though large, could not expand forever without fresh sources of income. Chung Po-tsai brought back reports from his visits to the districts. Captains spoke more openly about the possibility of a permanent settlement with the government. Some villages that had paid tribute for years now hesitated, fearing future imperial punishment if they continued supporting the fleet. The decision to seek amnesty formed gradually over several weeks. She discussed the idea first with Chung Po-tsai during quiet night watches on deck. He listened without interrupting, then offered practical thoughts on how such a move could protect the men and secure their own futures. She weighed the risks. Surrender could mean execution for leaders, confiscation of ships, or forced service in the navy. Yet continued fighting promised only gradual erosion. The Qing court had granted amnesties to other rebel groups in the past when the cost of suppression became too high. She saw a narrow window where the fleet's strength could be traded for terms that preserved lives and allowed a transition to shore. Contact began through intermediaries in Guangzhou. Trusted brokers who had handled opium and foreign silver carried messages to local officials. The first responses were cautious. Governors wanted proof that the Confederation would disarm and deliver its leaders. She responded by ordering a temporary halt to raids in several districts and redirecting some tribute payments toward gifts of rice and cloth for coastal garrisons. These gestures signaled seriousness without weakening the fleet. Negotiations moved slowly through the spring, with written proposals exchanged by fast boats under white flags of truce. She insisted on certain conditions from the start: full pardon for herself, Chung Po-tsai, and all captains who surrendered, permission to keep a portion of the accumulated silver, and the right for ordinary crew members to return to their villages without punishment. The Qing authorities, led by Governor-General of Guangdong and Guangxi, saw advantages in acceptance. A peaceful surrender would allow them to claim a major victory in reports to Beijing. It would also free naval resources for other threats and restore some control over coastal trade. By early summer, the outlines of an agreement took shape. The Confederation would hand over 200 junks as a token of good faith, along with most of its cannon. The remaining ships could be sold or converted for legitimate trade. Leaders would receive official ranks in the imperial system, which carried stipends and status but required loyalty oaths. Ordinary pirates could disperse with their personal shares. She called the flag leaders to a final gathering aboard the flagship in the sheltered waters near Lantau Island. The meeting took place under the canvas awning, with the same low table and charts that had served them for years. She laid out the proposed terms plainly. Some captains objected, arguing that the fleet could still outlast the Qing navy. Guopodai from the Black Flag remained silent for a long time before stating that he would follow her decision. Others calculated the personal benefits. Official pardon meant they could return to families without fear of arrest. She listened to every voice, then reminded them of the alternative years of shrinking tribute, increasing patrols, and eventual defeat that would leave no one with anything. The captains agreed by consensus rather than vote. The surrender would proceed. The practical steps unfolded over the following weeks. She organised the handover in stages to maintain order. Selected junks sailed into Guangzhou harbour under white flags, their red banners lowered. Crews stacked weapons on deck and stood at attention while imperial officials inspected the vessels. She and Cheng Po-tsai remained on the flagship until the final phase. The central fund was divided according to the regulations one last time. Each man received his share in silver and goods before dispersing. She kept her personal reserve untouched and added to it from the command portion. The bamboo tube now held enough to support a household for years on shore. The formal ceremony took place in September 1810 at a government hall in Guangzhou. She arrived by small boat, dressed in simple dark clothing rather than sea garb. Cheng Po-tsai stood beside her. Imperial officials read the amnesty edict aloud, granting pardon to all who had surrendered. She knelt briefly as required, repeating the oath of loyalty. In return, she received an official title as a minor naval lieutenant, a stipend, and permission to settle in the region. Cheng Po-tsai received a similar rank. Most captains accepted comparable positions or simply returned to civilian life with their shares. A small number of men who had committed serious crimes during the years of conflict faced execution. But the number stayed low because she had enforced the regulations strictly. The emotional weight settled differently on each person. For her, the day brought quiet relief rather than celebration. The ambitions she had carried since the flower boat years, security, stability, a future beyond constant risk, had finally taken solid form. She felt the absence of Zheng Yi sharply in those hours. He had built the fleet, and she had brought it to a safe harbour. Cheng Po-tsai stood straighter after the ceremony, his face calm. He had grown from a captured boy into a young man who understood the value of measured retreat. Crew members who had sailed with her for years shook hands on the docks and scattered toward their home villages, pockets heavier than when they had joined. Political forces in the capital viewed the amnesty as a success. Reports reached Beijing praising the governor for ending the pirate threat without a costly campaign. The court rewarded the officials involved and issued new instructions for coastal defence. Locally, the surrender brought immediate changes. Villages that had paid tribute for years now sent word of thanks mixed with relief. Merchants increased their trade without fear of interception. Foreign traders at Whampoa noted the calmer waters and reduced their own security expenses. Daily life shifted almost overnight. She and Cheng Po-tsai moved into a modest house near the river in Guangzhou, a solid structure with wooden floors and a small courtyard. The constant motion of the sea gave way to the steady rhythm of city sounds, vendors calling, boats passing on the Pearl River, the clack of abacus beads in nearby shops. She kept her habits of careful record-keeping, maintaining a private ledger of the silver they had retained and the stipend payments. The stone counters stayed packed away. She no longer needed them for ship counts. The terms of peace included one unexpected benefit. The Qing authorities allowed former pirates to engage in legitimate businesses, and many captains invested their shares in fishing fleets, salt trading, or small shops. She used part of the reserve to purchase a stake in river transport operations, a quiet way to stay connected to the water world she had known all her life. Cheng Po-tsai handled the practical side of these ventures, learning the land-based side of commerce with the same steadiness he had shown at sea. The road to amnesty had not been a sudden surrender, but a calculated transition guided by the same practical intelligence that had held the confederation together for years. She had traded the red flags and cannon for safety and status, preserving lives that might otherwise have been lost in prolonged fighting. The fleet that had once controlled the South China Sea now existed only in memory and official records. Yet the structure she had built, the regulations, the loyalty, the careful planning had served its final purpose. The woman who had begun on a tanker sampan and risen to command thousands now stood on solid ground, her future secured through the same quiet determination that had carried her through every stage of her life at sea. Returned to shore, the house she chose in Guangzhou stood on a quiet lane near the river, 2 stories high with grey brick walls and wooden shutters that opened to catch the afternoon breeze. It had belonged to a minor merchant family who had moved inland. The price came from part of the silver reserve she had guarded so carefully. The ground floor held a small courtyard with a stone well and space for storage. Upstairs were 3 rooms, one for sleeping, one for receiving visitors, and one she kept as a private study with a low table, shelves for ledgers, and a single window facing the Pearl River. The air carried the familiar smells of river mud, charcoal smoke, and distant cooking oil. For the first time in decades, she woke each morning to the sound of birds and passing carts, rather than the creak of timbers and the slap of waves. Daily routines shifted to match the new surroundings. She rose at the same early hour as always, brewed strong tea over a small charcoal stove, and sat at the table to review the household accounts. The stipend from her official rank arrived monthly in sealed envelopes delivered by a low-ranking clerk who bowed once and left without speaking. She counted the coins carefully, added them to the reserve, and noted every transaction in a new ledger bound in plain cloth. The bamboo tube from the flagship days stayed hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards, its contents untouched, except for occasional checks to confirm the seals remained intact. Chung Po-tsai moved into the house with her. At 26, he had the build of a man who had spent his life at sea, broad shoulders, steady hands, eyes accustomed to scanning horizons. He took charge of the practical side of their new life. He hired a servant couple, an older woman, to cook and clean, her husband to handle marketing and minor repairs. He arranged for the delivery of fresh rice, vegetables and fish from the floating markets, negotiating prices with the same calm authority he had used when collecting tribute. In the mornings he walked the nearby streets, learning the layout of shops, tea houses and warehouses. Afternoons often found him at the river docks, speaking with boat owners about transport contracts. She watched this transition with quiet approval. He adapted without complaint, turning the skills of command into the management of small business. Their first venture together centered on river transport. Using a portion of the reserve, they purchased 2 sturdy cargo junks, smaller than the flagships, but well-maintained and licensed for legitimate trade. The boats carried rice, salt, and cloth between Guangzhou and upstream villages. Chung Po-tsai oversaw the crews, hiring former Confederation men who had received amnesty and preferred steady work on the water. She handled the accounts, tracking loads, fees, repairs, and profits. The operation started small but grew steadily as merchants learned to trust the punctual deliveries and fair pricing. The junks flew no red flags, only plain banners with the family name. The work felt familiar yet different. No scouts, no cannon, no division of plunder. She found a quiet satisfaction in watching the boats return loaded with payment rather than captured goods. Social contacts in the city developed slowly. Former captains who had settled nearby visited occasionally, bringing news of their own ventures or families. They sat in the courtyard over tea, speaking in low voices about old raids and new businesses. Guo Podai from the Black Flag came once, now running a salt depot in a nearby district. He bowed formally, exchanged a few words about trade routes, and left without lingering. These visits served as reminders of the past without reopening it. She received them politely but kept conversations brief. The house remained a private space, not a gathering place for old comrades. Daily life included small habits carried over from the sea. She still inspected provisions, carefully tasting rice for weevils, checking vegetables for freshness. She kept a small altar to Tin Hao in the upstairs room, burning incense on the 1st and 15th of each lunar month. The rituals were simple. Light the stick, bow 3 times, let the smoke rise toward the window. No one commented on them. The servant couple understood the custom from their own boat backgrounds. Chung Po-tsai sometimes joined her, standing silently until the incense burned down. These moments carried no words, only the shared memory of years on the water. The city itself presented new details to observe. She walked the streets in the early mornings when the air stayed cool, noting the patterns of vendors setting up stalls, the flow of porters carrying baskets, the way officials moved through the crowds with attendants clearing the path. She learned the dialects spoken in different quarters, Cantonese in the markets, bits of Mandarin from northern clerks, fragments of foreign languages near the factories. She avoided the crowded areas where Qing soldiers patrolled in greater numbers, preferring the quieter lanes along the river. These walks gave her the same sense of reading a landscape that she had once felt scanning the sea from a masthead. Remarriage came in 1811. Chung Po-tsai proposed the union himself one evening, after the household had quieted. He spoke plainly. The arrangement would formalize their partnership, secure her position in the eyes of local officials, and ensure the business ventures passed to him without question if anything happened to her. She considered the matter for several days. The match made sense on practical grounds. He had proven reliable in every task she had given him, from leading squadrons to managing the new junks. She had no other close family in the city, and the stipend alone would not support the household indefinitely. The ceremony took place quietly at a local temple, with only the servant couple and 2 former captains as witnesses. She wore a simple robe of dark silk. He wore a tunic of the same colour. No feast followed, only tea and quiet conversation in the courtyard afterward. Married life changed little in outward routine. They continued sharing the same house, the same table for meals, the same discussions about cargo schedules and accounts. The difference lay in small details. He now handled official documents requiring a husband's seal. She signed as wife rather than widow. The arrangement carried no romance in the way land stories described it, but it brought mutual benefit. She gained a partner who understood her past and shared her practical outlook. He gained legitimacy and a clear line of inheritance for the business they had started. The union felt like an extension of the working relationship they had built over years at sea. Business expanded gradually. By 1812 they owned 4 junks and employed 20 men, most of them former pirates who had received amnesty. The operation focused on reliable routes, rice from upstream to Guangzhou, salt back to villages, occasional loads of cloth or tea. Profits stayed modest but consistent. She kept the accounts herself, entering each transaction in the ledger with the same precision she had used for tribute records. The silver reserve grew slowly, invested partly in the business and partly held in reserve. She never borrowed or extended credit beyond what could be repaid quickly. Relations with local officials remained formal but uneventful. The stipend arrived on time and her minor rank required no active duties. She paid taxes on the junks and the house without delay. When an inspector visited to check licenses, she offered tea and answered questions directly. The man left satisfied. No further inquiries followed. She understood that her past made her a figure of quiet interest, but the amnesty had closed the official record. As long as the business stayed legal and the household quiet, no one pressed further. Chung Po-tsai took on more responsibility each year. He negotiated contracts with merchants, hired and managed crews, and handled repairs on the junks. She stepped back from daily operations, focusing instead on the long-term planning. Which routes showed the best margins, which suppliers could be trusted, how much to set aside for future expansion. Their discussions happened in the evenings over tea, the same way they had once reviewed scout reports on the flagship. The topics had changed, but the rhythm stayed familiar. The city changed around them. More foreign traders arrived each season, bringing new goods and new regulations from the Qing court. Opium dens appeared in quieter districts, though she avoided any involvement. The river traffic grew heavier, with larger convoys moving under imperial protection. Their small fleet navigated these changes by staying reliable and uncontroversial. Merchants preferred partners who delivered on time and asked few questions. Personal habits remained steady. She still woke early, brewed tea, reviewed accounts. She walked the same lanes, noting small shifts, the opening of a new stall, the repair of a bridge. She burned incense at the altar, kept the household clean, and spoke little of the past. The servant couple grew accustomed to her ways and worked without direction most days. Chung Po Tsai returned each evening with news of the day's loads or repairs. They ate simple meals, rice, steamed fish, greens, then reviewed the ledgers together. By the middle of the decade, the business had stabilized. The junks ran regular routes, the accounts balanced, the reserve held secure. She had achieved what she had aimed for since leaving the flower boats, a life on shore with income, status, and safety. The years at sea had given her the tools to build it. The amnesty had given her the opportunity. The woman who had once commanded thousands now managed 4 boats and a household, and she found the scale appropriate to the stage of life she had entered. Old age in changing times. The years after the remarriage passed in a steady, unhurried rhythm that suited her advancing age. By the 1820s she had entered her late 40s, then her 50s, with the small signs of time appearing gradually. Grey threads in her hair that she pinned back without fuss. A slight stiffness in the mornings that eased after movement, eyes that sometimes narrowed when reading fine print in the ledgers. She remained active in the household and the business, though she delegated more of the daily oversight to Chung Po Tsai. He managed the growing fleet of 6 junks by the middle of the decade, hiring additional crews and negotiating longer contracts with merchants who shipped goods as far as Fujian and Guangxi. She reviewed the accounts weekly, still entering each figure in her precise hand, but the work took less time than before. The house near the river stayed much the same. The courtyard gained a few potted plants, chrysanthemums in autumn, bamboo in the corners that the servant woman tended. The upstairs study held the same low table and shelves, now with additional ledgers for the expanded business. She kept the small tin-how altar, renewing the incense sticks on the usual days. Meals remained simple. Congee or rice with steamed fish and greens, occasionally a dish of braised pork when the junks returned with extra provisions from upstream. She ate slowly, chewing carefully, a habit formed from years when food came irregularly at sea. Chung Po Tsai had grown into a respected figure in the river trade community. At 35 he carried himself with quiet authority, speaking little but listened to when he did speak. Merchants sought him out for reliable transport, knowing his boats arrived on schedule and his crews caused no trouble. He fathered 2 children with her in the early 1820s, a son born in 1822 and a daughter in 1824. The births came without difficulty. The household hired a midwife from a nearby village who had experience with boat families. She took an active role in raising them, teaching the boy to read simple characters from the ledgers and showing the girl how to tie knots and balance loads on small models of junks. The children grew up hearing stories of the river, but never the full details of their parents' earlier lives. She preferred it that way. The past stayed closed except in private moments with Chung Po Tsai. The city changed noticeably around them during these decades. The opium trade expanded steadily after the British forced open more ports following conflicts in the late 1830s and early 1840s. Warehouses near the factories filled with chests of the drug, and smaller dens appeared in quieter districts. She kept the family business away from any involvement. The junks carried only rice, salt, cloth, and tea. When merchants offered higher fees for opium transport, she declined politely, citing the risks of imperial inspection. The decision cost some income, but preserved their steady reputation. Qing officials cracked down sporadically on the trade, raiding shops and confiscating stocks, which made legitimate operators like theirs appear more trustworthy by comparison. Her habits in old age remained consistent. She still woke before dawn, brewed tea, and sat at the table with the morning light coming through the window. She walked the same lanes when the weather allowed, though the distances grew shorter. She noticed new faces among the vendors, younger men taking over stalls from fathers, and observed how the river traffic had thickened with larger convoys under armed escort. The sound of foreign languages drifted more often from the direction of the factories. English, Portuguese, fragments of other tongues she could not place. She listened without comment, filing the changes the way she had once tracked wind shifts at sea. Family life filled the days in small grounding ways. The son showed an early interest in numbers, helping with the accounts by age 10. The daughter preferred the courtyard plants and the servant woman's stories of village life. She taught both children practical skills, how to judge rice quality by feel and smell, how to read simple contracts, how to keep records that could not be disputed later. Chung Po Tsai handled the outdoor side, teaching the boy to swim in the river shallows, showing the girl how to steer a small sampan. The household functioned smoothly, with the servant couple now treated almost as family after more than a decade of service. Health concerns appeared gradually. She experienced occasional pains in the joints during damp weather, eased by herbal teas brewed from dried roots bought in the market. She consulted a local physician once or twice a year, a quiet man who prescribed tonics and advised rest. She followed the instructions without complaint, but never stopped her daily routines entirely. Chung Po Tsai watched her closely during these periods, making sure the household tasks stayed light. She appreciated the attention without acknowledging it openly. Words between them had always been few. The broader world shifted in ways that reached even their quiet lane. News of the Opium War arrived in fragments, first through rumours in the tea houses, then through official proclamations posted on walls. British warships appeared in the river, exchanges of cannon fire echoed from downstream, and treaties forced open new ports. Guangzhou remained under strain but avoided the worst fighting. Their business suffered briefly during the disruptions, trade slowed, junks waited at anchor but recovered once peace terms stabilized routes. She adjusted by focusing on local shipments between Guangdong villages, routes less affected by foreign involvement. In her 60s, during the 1830s and 1840s, she spent more time in the study. The ledgers grew thinner as Chung Po Tsai took over most entries. She reviewed them still, pointing out small discrepancies or suggesting minor improvements. She wrote occasional letters to distant relatives in the Pearl River Delta, simple notes asking after health, and enclosing small sums when possible. Replies came back with news of marriages, grandchildren, and the changing river markets. These connections kept her tied to her origins, though she never returned to the water villages herself. The children grew into young adults. The son entered the business fully by the late 1830s, handling contracts and crews under his father's guidance. The daughter married a merchant's son from a nearby district in 1842. The match was practical, with the family gaining useful alliances in the cloth trade. Weddings were modest temple visits, tea for relatives, small gifts exchanged. She attended both events seated in a quiet corner, watching the rituals with the same calm observation she had always shown. Weird habits from the sea years lingered. She still arranged small polished stones on the table when thinking through business decisions, though no one knew their original meaning. She tasted every batch of rice delivered to the house, a holdover from checking tribute quality. She kept the bamboo tube sealed and hidden, checking its contents once a year on the anniversary of the amnesty. These small acts anchored her to the past without dominating the present. Chung Po Tsai aged alongside her, his hair turning grey, his steps slower on the stairs. They spoke more in the evenings now about the children, the business, the way the city had grown. He never asked about the years before the flagship. She never volunteered. Their partnership had always rested on shared work rather than shared memories. The marriage had given both security and continuity, and that remained enough. By the early 1840s, she spent most days in the house. The walks shortened to the courtyard. She sat in the shade with a cup of tea, watching the river traffic from the upper window. News reached her through Chung Po Tsai and the Sun Treaty ports opening, foreign steamships appearing on the water, Qing reforms struggling to take hold. She listened, nodded, offered brief comments. The changes felt distant yet inevitable, like tides shifting in channels she once knew by heart. The household adapted to her quieter pace. The servant couple stayed on, their own children now grown and working elsewhere. Meals came at regular times, the house stayed clean, the accounts balanced. She reviewed the final ledger entries herself, though her hand trembled slightly on the brush. The The silver reserve had grown enough to support the family comfortably even if the business slowed. She felt no urgency to add more. The goal had been met long ago. Old age brought a calm acceptance of the world's movement around her. The river flowed as it always had, carrying boats and people past the window. The children visited often, bringing grandchildren who played in the courtyard. She watched them with the same steady gaze she had once turned on scout reports or tribute tallies. The past remained private, the present sufficient, the future entrusted to those who came after. Death and rumours. By the early 1840s, the pattern of her days had settled into one of quiet observation. She spent most hours in the upstairs room, the window open to the river breeze when the weather allowed. The ledgers lay closed on the shelf. Chung Po-tsai and the son now handled every entry. She reviewed them occasionally, pointing out a small error or nodding at a steady profit line, but the work no longer required her full attention. The children and grandchildren visited regularly, the son with business updates, the daughter with news of her own household, the little ones running across the courtyard stones. She watched them from her chair, answering questions in short sentences, sometimes resting a hand on a small head as they passed. Health declined, slowly but steadily. The joint pains that had started in her 60s grew sharper during the damp winters. She moved less, relying on the servant woman for help with stairs and simple tasks. The physician came more often, bringing stronger tonics and advising against the chill drafts that came off the river. She followed the instructions without argument, drinking the bitter brews and resting when told. Chung Po-tsai stayed close during these periods, sleeping in the next room so he could hear if she called in the night. The household adjusted without complaint. Routines shifted around her needs rather than forcing her to change. In the spring of 1844, she caught a persistent cough that settled deep in the chest. The physician diagnosed a weakness of the lungs, common in older people who had spent years breathing salt air and damp river mist. He prescribed rest, herbal steam, and small doses of ginseng. She followed the regimen for several weeks, propped against cushions in the study with the window cracked just enough for fresh air. The cough eased at times but returned stronger after any exertion. By summer, the family understood the illness would not leave. She remained clear in mind until the end. Conversations stayed practical questions about the junks, reminders to check certain contracts, instructions for the grandchildren's education. She spoke little of the past, though once, when the daughter asked about her childhood, she described the tanker boats in a few plain sentences, the way nets were hauled at dawn, the taste of congee flavoured with dried shrimp, the sound of water against hulls at night. The daughter listened without pressing for more. Chung Po-tsai sat nearby during these moments, adding nothing but a steady presence. The final days came in late summer. The cough weakened her until breathing became effort. She lay in the sleeping room, the bed platform covered with fresh mats, a small charcoal brazier keeping the air warm. Family members took turns at her side. The son read from a simple book of poems. The grandchildren played quietly in the courtyard below. She spoke less each day, mostly nods or single words. On the morning of the 16th of November 1844, she asked Chung Po-tsai to open the window wider. The river sounds carried in clearly oars dipping, boat horns in the distance. She listened for a time, then closed her eyes. The breathing slowed and stopped shortly after midday. She was about 69 years old. The household observed the customs quietly. The body was prepared according to local practice, washed, dressed in plain silk, laid out in the main room with incense burning at the small altar. Relatives arrived over the next days, distant cousins from the river villages, former business associates, a few old captains who had heard the news through the merchant networks. No large gathering took place. She had never wanted attention. The funeral procession moved through the lanes to a small cemetery plot near the river, chosen because it overlooked the water she had known all her life. The grave was simple, marked with a stone bearing her married name and the dates. Offerings of rice, wine, fruit and paper money were burned at the site. The family returned home the same evening. News of her death spread through Guangzhou in the way such things do among those connected to the river trade. Merchants mentioned it in tea houses. Boat crews carried word upstream. Former Confederation men still living in the area heard through their own channels. Some visited the house to pay respects, leaving small offerings at the door. Others simply nodded when the name came up in conversation, remembering the woman who had once held the largest fleet on the coast and then walked away from it intact. Rumours and stories had circulated around her even during her lifetime, growing more elaborate after the amnesty. In the years immediately following 1810, people in the river markets spoke of her as the woman who had commanded tens of thousands, yet surrendered without a fight, taking a fortune with her. Some claimed she had hidden vast treasure in coastal caves, silver ingots and jewels from captured foreign ships, waiting for the right moment to retrieve them. Boatmen told versions where she had kept a secret squadron hidden in Vietnam, ready to return if the Qing broke the amnesty terms. These stories stayed vague. No one produced evidence, and she never addressed them. During her shore years, the tales shifted. Vendors near the docks sometimes said she still owned half the river trade under false names, collecting silent shares from every major junk that passed Guangzhou. Others claimed she practiced certain sea rituals in her house, burning incense to dragons or consulting old charts at night, keeping some power from the pirate days. A few former captains who visited occasionally let slip fragments. How she had enforced rules no man dared break. How she had saved lives by negotiating the amnesty when others wanted to fight on. These accounts mixed respect with exaggeration, turning her into a figure larger than the facts allowed. After her death, the rumours took on a life of their own. In the 1850s and 1860s, as the Taiping Rebellion shook the empire and foreign powers pressed harder, stories resurfaced in new forms. Some said her treasure had funded resistance groups along the coast. Others claimed descendants still lived in hidden villages, waiting to reclaim the red flags. Popular pamphlets and oral tales in tea houses described her as a pirate queen who ruled with iron laws and vanished with wealth beyond counting. The details varied wildly. Some said she had been born to nobility and disguised herself among the tanka. Others that she had learned secret fighting arts on the flower boats. But the core remained. A woman of low origin who rose to command the seas and then retired unpunished. Reliable records stayed sparse. Qing officials noted the amnesty and her minor rank in routine reports, nothing more. Local gazetteers mentioned her briefly as a reformed pirate who lived quietly in Guangzhou. Family documents, the household ledgers, the children's birth records kept the facts simple. Chung Po-tsai preserved the bamboo tube and the stone counters in a sealed box, passing them to the son after her death. The objects carried no magic, only the weight of decisions made long ago. Her lasting place in Chinese history emerged slowly. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as historians began collecting accounts of the Qing period, she appeared in footnotes and brief entries as Zheng Yi, the wife who inherited and preserved the largest pirate confederation in the empire's history. Some scholars praised her administrative skill, noting how the regulations and the amnesty preserved lives that might otherwise have been lost. Others viewed her as a symbol of the coastal underworld that thrived when central authority weakened. In time, she became one of the few women from that era whose name survived in both official records and popular memory, not as a romantic figure, but as a practical one who navigated power, risk, and retreat with steady calculation. The grandchildren grew up hearing sanitized versions of her life. A woman who worked on boats, married a sea captain, and later ran a transport business. They learned the full story only later, from books or from the son who kept the old ledgers. By then the river had changed. Steamships replaced junks, foreign concessions lined the banks. The Qing dynasty had fallen. Yet in the small cemetery plot near the water, the stone still stood, weathered but legible, marking the end of a life that had spanned tanker sampans, pirate flagships, and a quiet house on shore. The stories continued long after the grave marker faded. In fishing villages and river markets, people still spoke of the woman who once flew red flags across the South China Sea and then folded them away forever. The rumours never quite matched the facts, but they carried a truth of their own, that even in a world ruled by emperors and tides, one person from the lowest rung could rise, command, and depart on her own terms. The story of Ching Shih has now reached its close. The river keeps flowing past the quiet grave, carrying boats and people as it always has. The years have softened the edges of her path from the patched sampan of childhood, through the lantern-lit flower boats, across the decks of 1,000 junks, to the still house near the water. What remains is not legend or treasure, but the simple record of choices made under pressure, rules enforced when chaos pressed close, and a final decision to step off the water while there was still time. Rest easy now. The night is calm, the fan hums softly if you have it running, and the story has found its shore.